uses its pronouns. Yeah, it's, you know, it's trying its best, but it has some weird ideas about things, maybe. Although it is kind of funny, the Emperor's like, nah, man, you know, we gotta eating Orpheus is literally the only option. Then you wake up Orpheus, and he's immediately like, oh no, I can totally just turn you into a mind flayer, but keep your human brain. So there's totally another option. It's like literally all you have to do is like wake me up for like 5 seconds and explain the problem, and I have a solution. It's like, well.
Oxygen efficiency decreased.
Got lots of titanium. Remember that song? Again, Finding Nemo. Bubbles! My bubbles. Oh boy, that's for anyone not really familiar with this game, incidentally, when an animal in this game has these weird bright green spots on it, that's a sign that it's been infected with the disease. I don't remember what the disease is called, but it's bad, and we gotta find a cure. But right now, at this stage of the game, we're not infected yet. I guess right now we're just surviving, but it feels a little ominous. I think I've seen 2 creatures showing signs of the disease so far. Honestly, I wonder how the game actually models that. Like, is it just totally random when they pop up, or is it actually
30 seconds.
Or does it actually like spread by like interaction? Like, if one character gets the disease, or one animal gets the disease, does that increase the odds that animals that pass through get the disease? Yeah, I think so. Interesting. Oh man, that's a cool shot with like the big moon, the huge ship. Okay, we got enough titanium to make an ingot. We could also hopefully free up some storage space, which is good. restored. Does that mean the lights are yeah. Oh, yeah, for anyone watching, check out that sunset. Like, or sunrise. Yeah, and you can still see the silhouette of like the moon, like right around it. That's cool. Clouds in this game, because it's like that big cloud bank right where the sun rises. That's so much to this game, honestly. Every time I play it, I'm like, yeah. This game fucks. Exploration, or like speculative zoology or xenobiology, or like spelunking for the ocean. I think I got poisoned by jellyfish.
Passing 100 meters. Oxygen efficiency decreased.
There we go.
30 seconds.
Oh, it should say that. Oh, okay. So I think proximity does. No, also I'm probably going to die here. Oops.
Oxygen.
Come on. Oh, nope, just barely made it. Okay. And I love kelp. This ocean is salty. Quartz. Yeah, I need some quartz. You all ever grow like your own crystals? I've done it like once or twice before. It's fun. I love making crystals.
Passing 100 meters. Oxygen efficiency decreased.
Stop talking about my efficiency, Elon. better pro brain than having to deal with the forbidden rock candy temptation. You know, like you want lick the forbidden candy. Oh yeah, incidentally, I might be listening to something in the background, and I'm not sure if you can hear it or not. If you can, let me know and I will stop. Oh yeah? There's
It is my considered professional opinion that a new kind of science shows that human
yes,
wisdom
I appreciate that, but
classic
genuinely,
point,
let
which
me
is
know
a
just
shame
so I
since
know.
he's a really bright man and once upon a time was maths, even if he's always been arrogant. As is well known, if only from his publicity, Wolfram was a child prodigy in mathematics who got his PhD in theoretical physics at a tender age, and then, in the early and mid-1980s, was part of a renewed interest in the subject of cellular automata, mathematical systems which are supposed to be like toy models of physics. Space consists of discrete cells arranged in a regular lattice, like a chessboard or a honeycomb. Time advances in discrete ticks. At each time, each cell is in one of a finite number of states, which it changes according to a preset rule, after examining the states of its neighbours and its own state. They were introduced by the great mathematician John von Neumann in the 1950s to settle the question of whether a machine could reproduce itself. The answer is yes. They have since found a productive niche in modelling fluid mechanics, pattern formation, and many kinds of self-organising systems. After the foundational work of von Neumann and co., there was a long fallow period in the study of cellular automata when publications slowed to a trickle. The major exception was a popular cellular automata invented by John Conway, The Game of Life, which spawned a dedicated following trying to fathom how such a ridiculously simple set of rules could produce such monstrously complicated results. In the late 1970s, mathematicians and physicists began to become increasingly interested in cellular automata, largely owing to the advent of comparatively cheap and powerful desktop computers, which let people visualize cellular automata. There was a school of thought following the physicist Ed Fredkin that thought the universe as a whole might in some sense be a cellular automata. Wolfram's first paper on cellular automata, published in 1983, focused its attention on particularly simple cellular automata: one spatial dimension, two possible states for each cell, and a neighbourhood consisting of the sites to the immediate right and left of the cell. There are 8 possible configurations for such neighbourhoods, and so 2 to the 8 or 256 possible elementary rules. In this paper, Wolfram introduced a useful scheme for referring to those rules and others by number. The string of 1s and 0s generated from the results of 111, 110, and so on is converted from binary into base 10. We can thus speak of Rule 18, Rule 110, and so on. Wolfram went on to publish Universality and Complexity in Cellular Automata, where he proposed a 4-fold classification of cellular automata based on their long-run behaviour. Class 1 decay to a fixed static configuration, Class 2 to periodic oscillation, Class 3 to seething pseudo-random chaotic GURP, and Class 4, which were supposed to have complicated and ordered structures interacting in odd ways, which never settle down. The scheme was popular for a while, but no one, including Wolfram, was ever able to make it more precise, and it's proved basically worthless for understanding what cellular automata do. It was a nice try.
Mix up your cat's mealtime with the Meow Mix playlist. Meow Mix has epic soundtracks for cats to jam out to, great eats and tasty beats. The perfect mix of delicious flavors to help you connect with your cat. Plus, take the remix quiz and discover your cat's zodiac sign and matching recipe. Meow Mix Original Choice Cat Food. The only one cats ask for by name.
Okay,
Tap the banner to try now.
Telling you that you can figure out your cat's zodiac sign. And like,
In the mid-1980s, Wolfram and collaborators developed the program Mathematica, a system for doing mathematics, particularly algebraic transformations and finding exact form solutions, similar to other packages such as Maple, MATLAB and Maxima, which began to appear around the same time. Mathematica was good at providing exact solutions, and also pretty good at graphics. Wolfram took the program private and entered into complicated lawsuits with his co-authors, all since settled. Wolfram has since retreated from normal scientific life into, on the one hand, tending the Mathematica empire, and, on the other, his peculiar scientific vision. The vision is of the universe as, if not exactly a cellular automata, then a simple discrete program of some sort. The method has involved an enormous number of man-hours on the part of subordinates who are, as it were, inserted to him, scanning the behaviour of likely-looking cellular automata and signing over the right to their discoveries to Wolfram. Their efforts are supplemented by frequent lawsuits and threats of lawsuits against those whom Wolfram feels to have infringed on his turf. In 1986, Wolfram filed a patent on the idea of using cellular automata as discrete approximations to partial differential equations long after the idea was commonplace in the field. It was, for instance, expounded at length in 2 papers in the 1983 conference proceedings he helped edit. What, then, is this new kind of science? Briefly stated, it is the idea we should give up trying on complicated continuous models using normal calculus or probability theory and the like, which try to represent the mechanisms by which interesting phenomena are produced. Instead, we should look for simple, discrete models like cellular automata, or simple programs as Wolfram calls them, which qualitatively reproduce certain striking features of these phenomena. In addition to this methodological advice, there is the belief that the universe must in some sense be a simple program. As Wolfram notoriously said, 4 lines of Mathematica. The bulk of this monstrously bloated book is dedicated to examples of this approach, such as cellular automata rules which produce patterns like the growth of coral or trees, or explanation of how simple cellular automata can be used to produce reasonably high-quality pseudo-random numbers. As the saying goes, there is much here that is new and true, but what is true is not new, and what is new is not true, and some of it even old and false, or at least utterly unsupported. Let's start with the true things that aren't new. Wolfram refers incessantly to his discovery that simple rules can produce complex results. The word discovery here is legitimate, but only in a special sense. When I took pre-calculus in high school, I came up with a method for solving systems of linear equations, independent of my textbook and teacher. I discovered it. My teacher, more patient than I would be with adolescent arrogance, gently informed me it was a standard technique in any book on linear algebra called Reduction to Jordan Normal Form, after the man that discovered it in the 1800s. Wolfram discovered simple rules producing complexity in the same way that I discovered the Jordan normal form. I am not going to dwell on the way that finding simple laws to account for multitudes of complex phenomena has been the highest aim of the physical sciences since at least Galileo and Newton, but this idea has been a driving force in mathematical logic and computer science since Alan Turing, A.N. Kolmogorov and Emil Post, he of the tag system, of which much more later. In an atrocious chapter on processes of learning and perception, Wolfram says that Mathematica, because it works by applying transformation rules to expressions that fit certain patterns, has a unique affinity for the way the human mind works, an affinity that isn't captured by any theory in cognitive science or AI. But this is just a rough description of the production rules approach to cognition, which was pioneered in the early 1950s by Herbert Simon and Alan Newell. In fact, their work helped derive the development of the Lisp programming language, from which Mathematica descends. The book is full to bursting with this kind of thing. In every area of science it touches on that I'm at all familiar with. I could go over Wolfram's discussion of biological pattern formation, gravity, and so on, and give plenty of references to people who've had these ideas earlier. They have also had them better, in that they've been serious enough to work out their consequences, grasp their strengths and weaknesses, and refine, or in some cases abandon them. That is, they have done science, whereas Wolfram has merely thought. By way of making the transition to the new untrue stuff, let's consider what we mean by simple and complex. This is a highly involved subject, as there are many different proposed measures of complexity. Naturally, Wolfram ignores all existing measures of physical complexity, and astonishingly avoids giving any quantitative measure of his own. Instead, he just says he'll count as complex things which are A. visually interesting, and B. pass standard tests for randomness, as used in computer programming and cryptography. Now, if something satisfies A, that is as much a fact about Stephen Wolfram, or more generously, the visual cortex, of the East African Plains ape as it is about the object. Passing B just means by the virtue of the work of Per Martin Lerth that the algorithmic complexity is not too low. As for the new untrue stuff, there's so much I hardly know where to start, but he and I were both trained as physicists, so I'll pick on his account of quantum mechanics, relativity and gravitation. If the universe worked by classical physics, one could argue a cellular automata approach to physics might work just as well as a continuous field approach, provided you made the scale of the cells small enough and the number of states per cell large enough. But we know classical physics isn't right. The universe is, to a much better approximation, quantum and relativistic. It's comparatively easy to define quantum cellular automata. What's harder is to get relativity right. Ordinary cellular automata are well adapted to classical spacetime, but not to the spacetime of either special or general relativity. With some ingenuity, you can get a discretized version of special relativity, as shown by Mark Smith in his 1994 dissertation, but no one has figured out how to make general relativity and with it gravity work in a cellular automata. Not long after the book was published, Scott Aronson proved that Wolfram's scheme must either conflict with special relativity, conflict with quantum mechanics, or indeed both. It is a non-starter. Another egregious weakness is biology. Wolfram displays absolutely no understanding of evolution or what would be necessary to explain the adaptation of organisms to their environments. This is related to his peculiar views on methodology. If you want to get a rough grasp of how a leopard may get its spots, then building a cellular automaton model or something similar can be very illuminating. It will not tell you whether that's how it works. This is an important example because there is a classic theory of biological pattern formation, or morphogenesis, first formulated by Alan Turing in the 1950s, which lends itself very easily to modelling in cellular automata. With a little fine-tuning, it produces things that look like animal coats, butterfly wings, and so on. The problem is that there is absolutely no reason to think that's how these patterns actually form. Indeed, the more biologists unravel the actual mechanisms of morphogenesis, the more complicated and inelegant, but reliable, it looks. If, however, you think you have explained why leopards are spotted after coming up with a toy model that produces spots, it will not occur to you to ask why leopards have spots, but polar bears do not, which is to say, you will simply be blind to the whole problem of biological adaptation. Leaving evolution and adaptation to one side, saving the qualitative phenomena doesn't mean you have the right mechanism, even qualitatively. In addition, if you want quantitative accuracy, either for engineering purposes or to compare hypotheses which all produce the same qualitative results, you obviously can't just get by with Wolfram's new kind of science, or as we say in the trade, with toy models. To be fair, toy models sometimes can be quantitatively accurate, but only in peculiar circumstances which do not generally obtain, and certainly don't extend to Wolfram's. We must not, however, expect this to deter a man capable of summarising his methodology in the brilliant aphorism, "I am my own reality check."
The 2026 Chevy Equinox is ready for your daily drives, weekend getaways, and everything in between. Plenty of cargo space, plus a big touchscreen that keeps all your tech right where you need it. It's more than an SUV. It's your Equinox. Chevrolet. Together, let's drive.
Grainger offers professional-grade products, easy ordering, and next-day delivery, making them the go-to play for everyone keeping arenas game day ready. Call, click, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
There is one new result in the book which is generally impressive, though not so impressive as Wolfram makes it out to be. This is a proof that one of the elementary cellular automata, Rule 110, can support universal computation. In 1936, Alan Turing proposed a class of automata which have since come to be called Turing machines, and showed that every function which can be defined recursively can be computed by a Turing machine. More remarkably, he showed that there were universal Turing machines, ones which could be programmed to emulate any other Turing machine. There are other models of computation, but so far it has turned out that everything they can compute can also be computed by Turing machines. The easiest way to show something is a universal computer is to show it can emulate something you already know is a universal computer, like a Turing machine. Now, it's been known since the work of Emil Post in the 1930s that something called a post-tag system is Turing equivalent. A new kind of science describes a new formal system called a cyclic tag system, Wolfram drops post, which is equivalent to a a post-tag system, and so too a universal Turing machine. Finally, there is a sketch of how propagating structures, called gliders, in Rule 110 can be used to implement a cyclic tag system, assuming you have an infinite lattice to play with. This is a genuinely new result. Rule 110 is the simplest cellular automata which is known to support universal computation. However, lots of things are capable of universal computation. There's less interest in this result than there would have been in, say, 1970. In 1990, for instance, Christopher Moore devised a kind of idealized pinball machine capable of universal computation. This result is neat for people who care about dynamic models of universal computation on the order of 1,000 scientists and mathematicians worldwide. What Wolfram wants to claim is that since one universal computer is equivalent to any other, by studying the behaviour of one, we learn things which are true of all others. Therefore, Rule 110 is as complex as anything in the universe and all intelligent life, including, perhaps, the gods. This, to put it mildly, does not follow. The real problem with this result, however, is that it is not Wolfram's. He did not invent cyclic tag systems, and he didn't come up with the incredibly intricate construction needed to implement them in Rule 110. This was done by Matthew Cook, a grad student working in Wolfram's employ under a contract with some truly remarkable provisions on intellectual property. Wolfram got to control not only when and how the result was made public, but to claim it for himself. In fact, his position was that the existence of the result was a trade secret in and of itself. After a messy falling out with Wolfram, Cook made the result and the proof public at a 1998 conference. Wolfram responded by suing and threatening to sue Cook, the conference organisers, and the publishers of the proceedings, and so on. Quick interjection here from the editor's room. I was putting some of my PhD level research skills to use and browsing the Wikipedia article for a new kind of science, and I came across a warning that the article may have been created or edited in return for undisclosed payments. I have literally never seen this before on Wikipedia. The talk page is also very interesting. There are lots of people getting extremely heated over Stephen Wolfram. Some people in favour of him, some people against him. Just check it out. It's a really fascinating read. Of course, lots of professors add their names to their students' papers, and many lab chiefs owe their enviable publication records to the fact they automatically add their names to the end of every manuscript prepared under their command. If Wolfram did this, he would merely be perpetuating one of the more common abuses of the scientific community, but to deny Cook authorship and threaten people with lawsuits to keep things quiet is very low. Happily, the suit between Wolfram and Cook has been resolved. Cook's paper has been published under his own name in Complex Systems. So much for substance. Let me turn to the style, which is that of monster-raving egomania, beginning with the acknowledgements. Conventionally, this is your chance to be modest, to credit your sources, friends, and inevitably long-suffering nearest and dearest. Wolfram uses it in 5-point type to thank his judges, including Matthew Cook, for technical content and proofs, and to thank people he's talked to, not for giving him ideas and corrections, but essentially for giving him the opportunity to come up with his own ideas, owing nothing to them. Bringing to mind Monty Python, your majesty is like a stream of bat piss. You shine out like a shaft of gold when all around is dark. This extends to him thanking his mother for giving him a classical British education. The customary self-effacement of scientific prose sometimes leads to boring writing, but it is immensely preferable to incessant self-aggrandizement. This even extends to grammar. Wherever possible, Wolfram talks about other people's efforts in the passive voice. Wolfram even has the gall to say he deliberately writes like this to help his readers understand his difficult ideas. Normally, scientific work is full of references to previous work, if only to say things like the outmoded theory of Jones, unable to accommodate stubborn experimental facts, has generally fallen out of favour. This is how you indicate what's new, what you're relying on, and how you let your readers immerse themselves in the web of ideas in a particular field of research. Wolfram deliberately omitted references from the science. Admittedly, this is sometimes done. Darwin did it in The Origin of Species to try and get it to press quickly, but Wolfram has written 1,100 pages over a decade. What would it have hurt to have included citations? In the endnotes, where he purports to talk about what people has done, he is misleading, wrong, or both. To acknowledge that he had predecessors who were not universally blinkered fools would conflict with the persona he tries to project to others, and perhaps to himself. Let me try to sum up. On the one hand, we have a large number of true but commonplace ideas about how simple rules can lead to complex outcomes and the virtues of core models. On the other hand, we have a large mass of dubious speculations, many of them also unoriginal. We have a single new result of mathematical importance, which is not the author's. Everything is presented as the inspired fruit of a lonely genius, delivering startling insights in isolation from a blinkered and philistine scientific community.
The modern pseudoscientist stands entirely outside the closely integrated channels through which new ideas are introduced and evaluated. He does not send his findings to the recognized journals, or if he does, they are rejected for reasons which in the vast majority of cases are excellent. As a consequence, he finds himself excluded from the journals and societies, and almost universally ignored by competent workers in the field. The eccentric is forced, therefore, to tread a lonely way. He speaks before organizations he himself has founded, contributes to journals he himself may edit, and until recently publishes books only when he or his followers can raise sufficient funds to have them printed privately.
In lieu of superfluous comments, let us pass on to Martin Gardner's list of the 5 ways in which a sincere pseudoscientist's paranoid tendencies are likely to be exhibited. 1. He considers himself a genius. 2. He regards his colleagues, without exception, as ignorant blockheads. Everyone is out of step, except himself. 3. He believes himself unjustly persecuted and discriminated against. 4. He has strong compulsions to focus his attacks on the greatest scientists and the best established theories. 5. He has a tendency to write in complex jargon, in many cases making use of terms and phrases he himself has coined. 1 is clearly true. 2 is clearly true. 3 is currently false, or at least not much on display in this book. 4 is clearly true, though Wolfram, befitting someone who was once a respectable physicist, aims to undermine Newton, Einstein, and the entire tradition of physical science since Galileo. Mercifully, 5 is true only to a very small degree. Editor's note again. I respectfully disagree with Professor Shalizi here. When I was rereading A New Kind of Science for this video, I noticed that the mathematical formulae in the endnotes are all written in Mathematica. So I understand why you would do this for programming sections, but how arrogant do you have to be to think that this is clearer than just writing the mathematical formulae? I don't get it. I really, really don't get it. When the crank's IQ is low, as in the case of the late Wilbur Glenn Voliver, who thought the Earth was shaped like a pancake, he rarely achieves much of a following, but if he is a brilliant thinker, he is capable of developing extremely complex theories. He will be able to defend them in books of vast erudition, with profound observations, and often literal portions of sound science. His rhetoric may be enormously persuasive. All the parts of his world fit together beautifully, like a jigsaw puzzle. The natural result is a cult following. This brings me to the core of what I dislike about Wolfram's book. It is going to set the field back by years. I don't object to speculation or radical proposals, even to radical, grandiose speculative proposals. I just want there to be arguments to back them up, and reasons to take them seriously. I don't object to scientists displaying personality in their work or staking out positions in vigorous opposition to much of the opinion in their field. I do object to ignoring criticism and claiming credit for commonplaces, especially before popular audiences who won't pick up on it. I don't even object to writing 1,000-page tomes vindicating one's own views and castigating doubters. I do object to 1,000-page exercises in badly written intellectual masturbation. I suppose it's customary in writing reviews of this sort to try to say what has driven Wolfram to write such a bad, self-destructive book, but the truth is, I couldn't care less. He has talent, and once had some promise. He has squandered them. I am going to keep my copy of A New Kind of Science on the same shelf as Atlantis in Wisconsin, The Cosmic Forces of Mu, of Grammatology, and The People Who Think the Golden Ratio Explains the Universe.
As a consequence, it was
How did our solar system come to be?
Alright,
How
sorry
did we
for the
come to
pause
be
there,
here?
folks.
It's a field that involves science,
Right.
engineering, and medicine now in a very significant way.
What is the brain's code for the actual world? How does it create this model of the world?
Behind the delivery trucks that keep your life stocked, thousands of BP employees go to work every day. They're part of around 300,000 jobs we support across the country. See all the ways BP is driving American energy forward at bp.com/investing in America.
It's not going to be able to be quietly funded without significant public scrutiny. In particular, it needed the stamp of approval of one very specific person. There are two Ronald Reagan quotes often associated with the SSC, both of which came following a cabinet meeting on January 29th of 1987. At the end, when Reagan finally gave his approval for the project, he was told that his decision would make a lot of physicists ecstatic. His reply was, "That's probably fair, because I made 2 physics teachers in high school very miserable." But the other quote gives a little more insight into Reagan's thought process. Following a presentation on the merits of funding the project, he reportedly pulled out an index card from his jacket pocket and went on to recite a poem by Jack London. "I would rather be ashes than dust." This continued on for about a minute. In a moment that is very on brand for late-stage Reagan, those in the room with him were unclear on what he was trying to say. Reagan would clarify with a different quote, which he pulled from his days spent as a football announcer. He was telling physicists to throw deep. It was time for a Hail Mary. It may be surprising to you that Ronald Reagan, of all people, would be so enthusiastic about a multi-billion-dollar project that is incredibly abstract and with almost no short-term economic or strategic benefits. But I think the line "throw deep" perfectly encapsulates Ronald Reagan's distinct brand of Cold War posturing. It took nearly 6 years of delicate political maneuvering by physicists and bureaucrats alike to get Reagan to throw deep with the SSC and the Department of Energy. It was like playing political whack-a-mole. Every time physicists would gain one ally in Washington, they'd either retire or get promoted, only to be replaced by someone who wasn't that much of a fan of the project. But eventually, they managed to sway several key members around the big man himself. First was George Keyworth, a nuclear physicist serving as Reagan's first science advisor. Eventually, he was joined by Alvin Tribblepiece, the director of energy research at the DOE. He did a lot of the legwork to eventually get the support of John Harrington, Secretary of Energy. And Harrington was finally high enough up the bureaucratic food chain to arrange that fateful cabinet meeting where Tribblepiece gave the push that ultimately swayed Reagan. All of this is especially remarkable, given that when Reagan first took office in 1981, one of his first acts was to try and shut the DOE down. During his presidential campaign, Reagan had actively made promises to do just that. The department was the exact kind of red tape, big government overreach he villainized through his politics. As soon as he took office, Reagan slashed programs left and right and began to dismantle the department. He cut all funding to the renewable energy and synthetic fuel programs, and in a particularly spiteful and petty act, he removed the solar panels Carter had installed on the White House roof. You can see just how little Reagan cared about the department by looking at who he chose to run it. Throughout Reagan's 8 years in office, he would appoint 3 secretaries of energy, each of whom was uniquely unqualified. His first pick was a dentist turned politician. His next choice, Donald Hodel, was closer as an ex-power grid administrator. And yet, he's most remembered for his proposed solution to the hole in the ozone layer, which was not to try and fix it, but rather suggesting that everyone just wear hats and sunscreen. His final secretary was John Harrington, a California real estate developer. Perfect. Now, hindsight has painted Reagan as anti-science, but I think this is a misconception. Reagan could be pro-science. After some small cuts in his first year in office, there was an immediate reversal. Funding for federal research and development grew by a whopping 50%. But of course, this came with a big, fat asterisk. Reagan was funding a very specific kind of science. As you might be aware, the Department of Energy is still around today. Reagan never went through with completely gunning, and it's likely because once he took office, he realized the department was for purpose. The DOE handles the country's nukes. So of course, under Reagan, while almost everything in the DOE was cut, the nuclear energy and nuclear weapons programs received massive increases. But let's visualize this another way. See those mountains back there? Well, they aren't actually mountains. They're the annual United States military budget. Now obviously this is on a different vertical scale than our collider here. If If I put them on the same scale, everything would be so squashed as to be useless. It's mostly for the aesthetic, but also to give you a sense of the evolving priorities of the US government. The Reagan bump, or Mount Gipper as I like to call it, is staggering when compared to the administrations that came immediately before and after it. Reagan oversaw the largest peacetime buildup in US military history. Reagan was intent on winning the Cold War, and his strategy was to outspend the Soviets in every area they could. And while most of this new funding was going towards personnel and equipment, an ever-increasing amount of it was going towards a new generation of high-tech weapon systems. Before Reagan, if you broke down all R&D funding in terms of civilian and military comes in at just 47%. Under Reagan, those digits just straight up swapped up to a whopping 74%. 3/4 of all R&D funding was now being used exclusively for military purposes. Take it from Reagan's science advisor, George Keyworth. Those areas that are most exciting and those most necessary to the economy or national defense should be supported at a higher level than areas that are dormant. Thankfully, for particle physicists, there was an upside. One of the exciting areas Keyworth was referring to was the search for the W and Z bosons over in Europe. Despite Reagan's priorities being defense, he was also a firm believer that the government had the responsibility to fund basic research. That meant low-level physics and chemistry. Recognizing that even though there was no short-term applications, many years down the line the research would prove to be essential. For that reason, and also the influence of Alvin Trivelpiece, funding for energy research rose by 80% under Reagan. If a few Americans could win some Nobel Prizes, then hey, that'd be a nice bonus. Other fields of science were not so lucky, and they began to resent nuclear physics as the teacher's pet of the US government. Less flashy areas such as condensed matter physics, renewable energy, medicine saw their budgets stagnate due to inflation, or in the worst cases, receive deep cuts. In the eyes of the Reagan admin, they were too application heavy. Those areas should be the responsibility of private industry, the invisible hand of the glorious free market. And of course, you can't discuss Reagan underfunding science without addressing his callous indifference to the AIDS crisis, which led to millions of unnecessary deaths. After years of protests and criticism from gay rights activists and epidemiologists, Reagan would reluctantly appoint a commission to deal with the AIDS crisis in 1987. Of course, in a very Reagan move, he selected Admiral James D. Watkins to be in charge of the committee. Once top dog of the Navy, his appointment was widely criticized, questioned even by Watkins himself. He was, after all, a devout Catholic who supported the military's ban on gay service members. Despite what you might expect, Watkins took his job seriously, advocating for $50 million in funding for research, improved sexual health education, and he criticized religious bigots who considered the disease an act of God. In his commission report, he would go on to request anti-discrimination laws for those suffering from AIDS. The commission report passed by a slim vote of 7-6. Reagan would go on to ignore most of the suggestions made by Watkins. Although he didn't say so publicly, behind the scenes, Watkins was said to have been angered and depressed. But there is only one thing that Reagan loved more than the amount that he hated the gays: space. Throughout the 80s, NASA's budget was either stagnant or marginally declining. But in actuality, Reagan was pumping plenty of money into space tech. It was just going to a different department, the Department of Defense. See, NASA is explicitly for non-military space applications. Military space funding simply falls under the classified umbrella of the Air Force, and its space division far outpaced the budget of NASA. When it came to space projects, Reagan had a knack for betting on overambitious ideas that hemorrhaged money and never saw the light of day. For example, during Reagan's 1984 State of the Union address, where he said the words free and freedom 25 times, he announced that he was directing NASA to build the ludicrously named Space Station Freedom. This bloated project was intended to be a peaceful, civilian-based orbiting research lab until the Department of Defense began encroaching, demanding that it could, at any point, carry out national security work on the station, unvetted and without the permission of any other nation sharing the station. Indeed, any partner nations would not be allowed to, and I quote here, displace either the reality or symbol of US leadership. Would it surprise you that other nations were reluctant to join on to the project? Ultimately, the bloated plan was never able to get off the ground. It underwent nearly 7 redesigns and scalebacks before ultimately being scrapped in 1993. Another of these pipe dreams was the so-called Orient Express spaceplane, a hypersonic plane that could take off and land at regular airports, but which could also deliver satellites into space. After spending around $3 billion, the project was canned in 1994, and the technology was considered unworkable. But of all of Reagan's failed Cold War babies, the most ridiculous of all of these was an outer space, laser-based missile defense system that was nicknamed Star Wars. It never saw the light of day because it relied on a magical X-ray laser technology that hadn't been invented yet. It still hasn't been invented yet. The missile defense system was pure science fiction, but Reagan was so enamored with the idea that his obsession killed the 1986 nuclear disarmament talks with Gorbachev. Ronnie loved his sci-fi space lasers so much that he walked away from what could have been the effective end of the Cold War. Throughout its life cycle, Star Wars wasted nearly $60 billion over 10 years before being scrapped completely. But, to hear it from Reagan's top generals, these colossal wastes of money weren't entirely wastes of time. See, these lofty science fiction projects may have been unattainable in hindsight, but so long as the USSR thought they were even remotely possible, the Soviets would continue to sink billions of dollars they didn't have into trying to keep pace with the Americans, hopefully one day bankrupting them. And, to a certain extent, money troubles did lead to the collapse of the Soviet Union. On the other hand, this relentless defense buildup led to a massive deficit that would follow the US into the next two administrations. So, with all this context, it should be obvious now why Reagan was so eager to support the SSC. George Keyworth knew that Reagan had a personal investment in projects that appeared imaginative and ambitious, and thus worked hard to pitch the SSC in the same light as projects like Star Wars. But whereas those projects helped to probe the frontier of outer space, the SSC would probe the opposite end of the spectrum, inner space. And when I use the term frontier, that's not me clumsily adding subtext. It was the specific language used by many physicists to help sell the SSC as a way to reassert American dominance. To give you a sense of how the government viewed the SSC, Secretary Harrington stated that the SSC would be the high-energy physics equivalent of putting a man on the moon. And in a lot of ways, the SSC truly was like putting a man on the moon. For one, the US did not win the space race. Let's get that out of the way. They were beaten by the Soviet Union to every conceivable milestone. It was only by choosing a grand and ostentatious goal with a high chance of failure that the US was able to move the goalposts and reshape the narrative that they won the space race. This was an approach typical of US government-funded science. Bold, big advancements where they would leapfrog over the competition. And whereas they competed with the Soviet Union when it came to space, their rival in the realm of particle physics was Western Europe. American projects aimed for the stars, designing riskier, bigger machines that were miles ahead of the slower, less ambitious, and meticulously engineered European counterparts. Europe's accelerators were far more likely to work on their first attempt, but that slower process meant that throughout the 60s and 70s, the US had beat them to many important breakthroughs. The SSC was very much following in this template, a bold leap forward in terms of both max energy and size. But it was also very risky. Years of R&D would be required for magnets, a massive empty location with stable geology that could handle years of tunneling. It was a massive gamble, but it was the kind of gamble that Reagan loved to make. In 1987, in a last-ditch effort, the director of CERN, Erwin Schopper, testified in front of Congress and argued that the US should abandon the SSC and join up with Europe. They were in the early stages of construction on their newest collider, the LEP. He argued that there was significant overlap between the two machines. Even better, they were specifically making the tunnels large enough so that if they wanted to upgrade 10 years down the line, then they could, easily. But, despite this open invitation, or maybe even because of it, the Reagan admin barreled forward. America would regain its dominance in particle physics with or without the Europeans. So with Reagan's endorsement, R&D funding could shift into high gear. Now, there were concerns within the academic community that marketing the machine as a symbol of American supremacy could deter other countries from participating in the construction. However, most seemed to understand the reality that this was the price they had to pay to get Reagan on board. This will absolutely not come back to haunt the project in any way, shape, or form. At all. Meet Maury Tinker. Maury has been toiling away in the background of the story for a while now. When the DOE approved an initial research phase for the SSC in 1984, Maury was picked to lead the planning team out of Berkeley, California. He was widely viewed among the community as one of the brightest minds in accelerator design, having been responsible for Cornell's accelerator. The DOE was impressed with Tigner's efficiency and thoroughness, and also by how he inspired loyalty in his team. He worked hard, and his team respected him. And in a field of so many conflicted voices, the DOE viewed him as the only suitable candidate to become the full-time leader of the R&D. With the plan laid out, the DOE allocated a few dozen million in funding, a small enough amount that Congress didn't have to be consulted. Like I mentioned previously, accelerators are really just three components: a tunnel system, thousands of ultra-strong magnets, and a series of detectors. The detectors, thankfully, could come much later in the project's life. The key criteria that needed to be figured out were A, how big is the tunnel loop going to be, and B, how are they going to make the magnets. Collider performance is really a three-way compromise between the size, max energy, and magnet strength. Ideally, we'd make the loop as small as we could, because tunneling and construction is incredibly expensive. But at the same time, if we want a smaller loop, we need stronger magnets to compensate. And magnets aren't cheap either. And these weren't just any magnets. They were going to be 17-meter-long, superconducting niobium titanium magnets, which meant that to maximize their performance, they would need to be held at temperatures barely above absolute zero. If they rise in temperature too much, just 4 degrees above absolute zero, the magnets quench and lose their superconductivity. This is usually followed by a rapid surge of heat that can melt components or even cause an explosion. For all these reasons, each magnet would likely cost around tens of thousands of dollars, and they'd need around 8,000 of them. So, to summarize, if you lock in max energy and you lock in magnet strength, the size of the collider is really the only variable they could increase. Somewhere in the middle of all this was the sweet spot, and Maury Tigner's team needed to find it. In early 1984, there were reports from CERN that evidence of the top quark had been found. This turned out not to be the case, but the false alarm still put pressure on the design team. CERN kept bragging that their eventual upgrade could support energies up to 18 TeV. The SSC needed to go above and beyond to justify its existence. So, for both technical and political reasons, Tigner's group decided on a colossal total energy of 40 TeV. The loop would have a diameter of 30 kilometers, nearly 3 times as big as CERN's. If predictions were correct, the SSC would absolutely find the top quark and hopefully the Higgs boson as well. They estimated a 9-year project length, 3 for full R&D, and 6 for construction. The new estimate for the cost was updated to 7.5 to 8.3 billion. On the higher end, but certainly not outrageous. After soliciting a number of different magnet proposals that varied in shape, materials, and strength, they settled on a magnet that could operate at 6.6 Teslas, powered by nearly 12,000 amps of current. This magnet won out over a design by a group in Texas, who had a cheaper but weaker magnet. The choice ultimately came down to the size of the collider. If they went with Texas's magnet, the loop's diameter would be nearly double in size, making the whole thing prohibitively expensive. But here's where the drama comes in. The Texas group refused to accept this decision, saying that there was no way the R&D team could meet their deadlines with the other designs. Now, whether the design would have been any better, we can't really say, but they were right when they predicted that Tigner and his team wouldn't be able to meet their deadlines. The prototypes were a mess, way over budget and behind schedule by over a year. The magnets consistently quenched before achieving their target strength of 6.6 Teslas. Basically, the fields are so strong that the magnets would literally tear themselves apart if not properly constrained, generating heat that ruined the superconductivity. Solving this problem took nearly a year of work that ate up much of the R&D budget. In the years since the SSC was first conceived, its estimated cost had ballooned significantly. In 1982, the most optimistic estimates were saying around $4 billion. When R&D began in 1984, better estimates said $8 billion, factoring in magnet delays, 10.7 billion. Now, by 1988, numbers as high as 14.1 billion were being thrown around. It had doubled in cost since the DOE first approved the project, all while the federal deficit had been growing wildly out of control. Congress was instituting tougher and tougher budget restrictions, and if they wanted construction funds, Congress was going to have to approve them. To stave off any cuts, Energy Secretary John Harrington made a vague promise that nearly 30 to 50% of the project funding would come from foreign partners. But as of yet, there have been no eager volunteers. Weird that other countries aren't so keen to sign on to a project marketed as an America First project with American leadership on American soil. I'm sure this definitely isn't an omen of things to come. So in the meantime, with no foreign partners, Congress denied funding to begin construction for 2 back-to-back years, instead only giving out $230 million for more R&D. The budget was growing, just not as much as physicists would have liked. Construction would have to wait for whoever the next president was going to be. Behind the scenes, the project had just narrowly avoided a disaster that could have stalled its momentum for years. The SSC hit its first major budget snag in spring 1988. Somehow, in a shockingly negligent oversight, the DOE had forgotten to request funding for the Location Search Task Force. During their travels across the country, the task force had racked up a bill of $19 million, which wasn't accounted for in the fiscal budget, and Tigner's boss, Wilmo Hess, who was in charge of the search committee, refused to go back to Congress and request more. Instead, he insisted that the $19 million be cut from the R&D team's $61 million, which put Maury Tigner in one of the worst positions imaginable. It was already halfway through the fiscal year, which meant that R&D had already committed funds to the magnet development, the purchasing of superconducting wire, and staff salaries. Can you guess which one the DOE wanted Tigner to cut? And when I mean cut, I actually mean lay off almost his entire staff. Tigner, as you might expect, refused to do that, since they were already behind schedule, but also because he'd be laying people off who had no jobs to go back to. Many of his employees had left comfy university positions to come work for him. Applying for funding for academic jobs is often a months-long process with no guarantee you'll be approved. If you let them go, he'd be screwing them over with no guarantee they'd even want to rejoin the project for a full year. Tensions reached their peak on a particularly nasty Friday the 13th. Wilmo Hess phoned him up and ordered him to deliver a list of names to fire that same day. Tigner reluctantly began making a list. Disaster was thankfully averted by lunch, when news came that the chairman of the Appropriations Committee had finally allowed the DOE to take the missing $19 million from elsewhere. Tigner held his ground, saved his employees, and likely a ton of momentum for the project. It was a small victory, but Tigner's refusal to give him the DOE orders had made him some enemies. When he first joined the project, he was viewed as a highly respected and competent academic. Now, he was labeled as someone who didn't follow orders, and that would have consequences in the coming months.
The sea doesn't care where you came from, only who it can make you. Stronger, smarter, braver. Here, Americans are forged into sailors. This is their classroom, where honor, courage, and commitment are taught by the world's toughest teacher.
That was our ship. We were on that ship, but it crashed, and we got out of the lake pod.
Out of the blue, the DOE would receive an unsolicited proposal written by an Edwin Goldwasser, high-ranking member of the R&D team. He argued in this 14-page proposal that the URA was the logical organization to manage both the construction and eventual operation of the SSC lab. Now, the URA, for context, is the Universities Research Association, a nonprofit that consists of nearly 90 universities which operates the US's largest physics labs. Among these was Fermilab, which at the time was home to the world's largest accelerator. It seemed only natural that URA should be sole-sourced to manage the new collider. However, there was a question of ethics. Was it acceptable to award such a big contract to the first and only organization to submit a proposal, or should the DOE wait and have a public bid to avoid accusations of corruption? And in fact, Alvin Trivelpiece actually brought up this proposal in a meeting with high-ranking DOE officials, and supposedly one of those high-ranking officials, possibly Secretary Harrington himself, had a pen in hand ready to sign the proposal until they asked if the matter had to be resolved right this second. Trivelpiece reluctantly said no, and the proposal was tabled. It stayed this way for months. Eventually, Trivelpiece stepped down from his role in the DOE, and the project had lost its last remaining key supporter in the White House. Months later, the URA sent in a slightly revised proposal for a second time. But Trivelpiece's interim successor, James Decker, wasn't a confirmed political appointee, and thus didn't have the clout to push the proposal up the food chain. Again, poor timing prevented the project from moving forward. It wasn't until August of 1988 that the DOE officially put out a public call for proposals to manage the SSC. But the deadline was only 3 months away, way too soon for a project of this scope. Really, the only group that could meet a deadline like that was one that had already submitted a proposal. In essence, the DOE was telling the URA that yes, you can have the job, but we don't trust a bunch of egghead scientists to do it on their own. The URA was now going to have to jump through additional bureaucratic hoops to show that they are willing to play ball with the administration. First, they wanted the URA to bring in private industrial companies to assist in the construction. And secondly, they wanted them to prepare a clear chain of command for the lab. So, the URA begrudgingly complied, submitting a report that was much more in line with the billion-dollar proposals commonly found in the military-industrial complex. The modified proposal brought on Sphered-Up Corp and EG&G Inc. as equal partners. The former would handle the construction of the facilities, and the latter would be responsible for admin, electronics, and scientific instruments. The physicists at URA were unhappy with having to bring on members of the military-industrial complex, but they knew this was the only way to please the Reagan admin. This would prove to be a very delicate relationship further down the line, but for the time being, it would get the ball rolling. Now, as quickly as things were with the contractors, things were about to get a lot more personal with the selection of the SSC's director. This pick will determine the person who would lead the lab through its construction and likely many years afterwards. But there was an ethical dilemma here. The URA was submitting a confidential government proposal, and what that meant is that they couldn't hold a public search for a director, as that would violate governmental regulations, jeopardizing the bid. In essence, they were worried about the science equivalent of insider trading. So the URA opted to conduct the search in secret, severing their connection to the existing R&D team headed by Maury Tigner. Dozens of names were thrown around for the proposed director. Names you might recognize were Burton Richter and Samuel Ting. Maury Tigner was another top candidate, although he was unaware of this at the time. Even Alvin Trivelpiece was considered, and it's speculated that he resigned from his position at the DOE to avoid a conflict of interest. Reportedly, the two runners-up were Leon Lederman, director of Fermilab and the SSC's godfather, and Nicholas Samios, director of Brookhaven. But the winning candidate was Roy Schwitters. Schwitters had worked under Burton Richter and had played a key role in the November Revolution, as well as being a manager on one of Fermilab's major experiments. It had given him prior experience managing hundreds of workers, which was not something that most physicists could claim. But what really locked him in as the pick were his skills as a communicator. He was polished, statesmanlike, and in the eyes of the URA, the exact kind of person who could convince Congress that the SSC deserved funding. He was the tycoon archetype, someone who could unite small and big science towards a common goal. It's also rumored that it was an editorial that Schwitters wrote in Politics Today that convinced Secretary Harrington to back the SSC. So with the director chosen, URA finally drafted up a chain of command below Schwitters to submit to the government. Directly under Schwitters, you had Maury Tigner, serving as deputy director. Helen Edwards would serve as head of the accelerator division, and Bruce Chrisman as director of laboratory administration. And finally, Sphered-Up executive Robert Robbins, yes, also a real name, he would be the head of conventional construction. As the deadline drew near, the original 14-page proposal had morphed into a monstrous 3-volume, 6-inch thick proposal. As one executive put it, bureaucratically, it was gorgeous. Just in time, the proposal was submitted. And, as many expected, it was the only proposal submitted. The URA had, this entire time, been the only organization with any hope of managing the project. And after a year and a half of bureaucratic hoops, the URA was finally approved to build the SSC. And yet, the day the management contract was signed, Maury Tigner resigned. It was clear he had made up his mind months ago. Before even a single shovel could break ground, a critical member of the management chain had left. It seems there had been a growing animosity between the existing R&D group and the incoming URA management team. There had been a prevalent assumption that Maury Tigner was the obvious choice for director, at least among his loyal R&D group. Maury had been partially blindsided by the selection process, as URA had carried it out in secret to avoid a conflict of interest. In the end, Maury was passed over because he was known for being guarded and impatient with non-physicists, overly blunt at times. His technical wizardry was unrivaled, yes, and he was considered the best man to build the SSC, just not to manage it. Schwitters was much more adept at wooing the Washington bigwigs who would be necessary to keep the project alive. As a consolation, Maury was named deputy director. He and Schwitters would negotiate their respective roles. However, these discussions were unproductive and emotionally fraught, with Maury never satisfied. Schwitters soon realized there was a gap between them that couldn't be bridged. It was clear he wanted total authority on lots of detailed stuff that couldn't be guaranteed. He had a very specific list of people he demanded in key roles. So if not the deputy director, then perhaps the project manager, a role many of his peers thought would be ideal for him. It was less front-facing than the deputy job, requiring far less public relations and far more technical know-how. Well, according to Tigner himself, the DOE had indicated that I would not be acceptable as project manager. Ever since that fateful phone call, the DOE labeled him a troublemaker. And so there was only one path left for Maury, going back home to Cornell. When Tigner left the project, so did many of the loyal senior staff who worked beneath him. Thus, many of those who had spent 5 years working on the R&D side were simply gone from the project. Those that did stay were much fewer in number and peppered throughout the project in mid-level positions that gave them much less seniority than they previously had. The selection of Schwitters over Tigner, and then Tigner's eventual departure, was the first sign that big physics was changing. Gone were the days of risky, pioneering academics given free rein. Now it was the age of the corporatist, conservative physicist, beholden to bureaucracy and micromanagement. This split in attitude would prove irreparable and would lead to worse clashes down the line. Maury Tigner was the first person on this chart to leave, and he won't be the last. But for now, it was time to get to work. It was time to build a collider. While the selection of the URA and Roy Schwitters were both big news, for the country at large there was a far more interesting contest playing out. Where was the SSC going to be located? In terms of a timeline, there was a strong push to have the site selection finalized by the end of 1988. This would allow Reagan to be able to leave office in January with one last major announcement, a final accomplishment he could claim as his own after 8 years in office. And so the clock was ticking. In April of '87, the site selection contest was announced. Now, as exciting as the project was to scientists, it wasn't exactly going to appeal to the average US citizen, or more importantly, the average state politician. So instead of marketing the SSC as a science machine, the feds marketed it as a job creation machine. Specifically, one that would create 2,200 temporary construction jobs, 4,500 permanent lab jobs, as well as a guaranteed source of $660 million in yearly funding. Jobs win votes. Simple as that. And with that, the grand prize had been set, and the contest had the attention of nearly every state in the nation. After 5 months had gone by and the September deadline rolled around, the Department of Energy had received 46 proposals from nearly half of the 50 states. Of these, 7 were outright rejected for not even meeting the bare minimum requirements, including one that was pitched to be in space. Since the US doesn't own outer space, it failed to meet the very first condition. For a similar reason, another site that straddled the US-Canada border was also rejected. This was the only international submission to the site contest, and honestly it had a lot going for it. It would have crossed over between upstate New York and southern Quebec, much like how CERN straddles the French and Swiss borders. This fact alone would have mitigated concerns about the SSC being an American-centric project, and potentially could have led to broader international support. And also, the location would have benefited from massive electricity savings because of the nearby, cheap Canadian hydroelectricity. Despite all this, the proposal was thrown out by Secretary Harrington because the DOE was adamant about the site being entirely within the US. It wasn't so much that the site wasn't picked, but rather the outright rejection that would go on to sour relations with the Canadian government. But even more so, the rejection greatly distressed the congressional delegation from New York, and in particular, Republican Sherwood L. Boehlert. I'm singling him out for no reason at all. A more intense second round of evaluations further narrowed the list from 36 proposals down to just 8 finalists, which were announced in December of 1987. Arizona, Colorado, Illinois, Michigan, New York, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Texas. And almost overnight, there were some big changes. First, there were accusations of favoritism. This is a little far-fetched considering Reagan and Harrington's home state of California hadn't made the shortlist, almost entirely because California is far too susceptible to earthquakes. A slightly more valid concern was preferential treatment for wealthier states. See, the DOE had made a big show about how cost savings weren't going to be considered in the initial rounds, as they wanted the decision to be as impartial as possible. What they feared would happen was a bidding war, where bigger states that were more wealthy would just offer state funding as an incentive, leaving smaller states at an inherent disadvantage. So for that reason, a coalition of smaller states passed a law requiring all financial incentives to be submitted in a sealed envelope and only opened after the winning site was chosen. This, of course, was a farce, because many state legislatures would make very public announcements about how they were offering over $1 billion in state funding, and the task force would just have to pretend like they hadn't heard any of it. The second big change was much worse for long-term support of the project. Marketing the SSC as a job creation machine and not a science machine had enormous short-term benefits. The site competition had been fierce, with many enthusiastic proposals vying for those tantalizing jobs. But as the majority of the states were cut from consideration, almost overnight their elected representatives pivoted from supporting the project to loudly complaining that the SSC was nothing more than a $15 billion parasite that was monopolizing the bulk of the nation's science funding. You couldn't even market the SSC as a science machine now, because now the rhetoric had shifted to how bloated the project was and how we should instead be funding several smaller scale physics projects. In hindsight, this should have been an obvious outcome. Only one state was ever going to host the machine, and therefore those oh so valuable jobs. Only a few days after the announcement of the finalists, New York Governor Mario Cuomo withdrew the Rochester, New York site for consideration. Apparently, there had been a strong local opposition to the project due to its relative proximity to a large city center. Now, with the sole exception of Chicago, Illinois, the remaining 7 site locations were all extremely rural, with far fewer people who would need to be displaced to build the project. Each of the remaining sites had their own advantages. Arizona, for instance, would only have to displace 4 families, compared to the hundreds of families at other sites. Tennessee and Colorado had the best geology for cheaper tunneling. Texas, Michigan, and North Carolina sites each had a good variety of industrial infrastructure nearby. But for most academics, the winner was a foregone conclusion. The contest was just a months-long dog and pony show to give the impression of political fairness. Fermilab, located in Chicago, Illinois, was inarguably the best choice for the site. Chicago was no stranger to this exact sort of competition. It had been the winner of a 1966 site selection competition to build Fermilab in the first place. And to beat a dead horse here, it was home to the world's largest particle accelerator, the Tevatron. With Fermilab already constructed, you'd be saving enormous sums of money on the existing lab infrastructure and the hiring of thousands of staff and researchers, with ample housing and universities right nearby. But perhaps the strongest reason, advocated by Nobel laureate James Cronin, was that the building of the SSC at Fermilab would keep the US at 4 particle accelerator labs, not 5. He argued that Europe enjoyed the advantage of only having to support 2 accelerator labs. Going from 4 labs to 5 would only be making their problem worse. During a week-long retreat, the task force wrote the final evaluations for the remaining 7 sites, and they submitted the report to the DOE on November 7th of 1988. A few days later, Secretary Harrington made the final call. The SSC was going to be built in Texas. What?
At Cox, your internet and mobile price won't change for 5 years, from 5 Halloweens to 5 4th of Julys. Same price, guaranteed. Cox, a step ahead. Requires 2 gig speeds and gig unlimited mobile. Taxes and fees excluded from price lock. Mobile data speeds reduced after 20 gigs.
What do you mean, Texas? That was the phrase that reverberated throughout the scientific community. And if tensions weren't high enough, just a few days earlier, in a much less surprising result, George H.W. Bush had defeated Michael Dukakis in a brutal presidential campaign. There was soon going to be a Texan in the Oval Office. Congress immediately requested an ethics investigation from the U.S. Government Accounting Office, but no wrongdoing was found. The real reason that Fermilab lost out to Texas is far less scandalous, but still just as infuriating. In evaluating the 7 finalists, there were 2 clear contenders: Fermilab and Texas. Each had been judged according to 4 categories. On geology and regional resources, both Fermilab and Texas received outstanding ratings, the highest possible. But on the environmental category, Fermilab only received a good rating, whereas Texas still received outstanding. But it was the 4th and final category where everything fell apart for Fermilab. For setting, Fermilab received a poor rating, the only finalist state to receive a rating that bad. See, out of the remaining 7 finalists, only Fermilab was situated in what could be considered a non-rural area, and there was resistance within the local communities due to concerns about displacement due to construction, noise pollution, and increased traffic. But among these concerns, you had an even louder minority. Catch Illinois was a protest group who often picketed outside Fermilab to oppose the SSC expansion. They argued absurd claims that the experiments would result in nuclear waste production, despite the fact that this is This is not the kind of research that particle accelerators do. And also, Fermilab had been operating a particle accelerator for nearly 20 years with no negative impacts on the community. It's thought that these fears were driven partly because of the enormous nuclear weapons cleanup that was occurring at the time, as well as the Chernobyl disaster from a couple years earlier. The anti-nuclear movement was at its most influential. But it wasn't just that there was local opposition. It was more so that Ketch, Illinois had specifically threatened to tie up this project in the courts for 35 years. Worried that the DOE wouldn't be able to acquire the land in time to begin construction, the Fermilab site was considered too volatile and ultimately given the rating of poor. As for the Texas site, located just south of Dallas in the town of Waxahachie, it was the only location to receive 4 outstanding ratings. It was an outcome that came as a complete shock to nearly everyone in the academic community. Not quite everyone, though. Richard Lundy, a physicist at Fermilab, made a bet with a colleague in late October. He told them to write down 3 predictions. 1. The SSC would be situated in Texas. 2. URA would be granted the management contract. 3. The project would fold in 5 years or less. He was now 2 for 3. And exactly 5 years later, almost to the month, he would be 3 for 3. But until then, plans marched on. The crown jewel of American particle physics was moving to Texas. And you know what they say? Everything's bigger in Texas.
I like organizing things.
It's a chilly November morning in Chicago. 2 days ago, George H.W. Bush won the 1988 presidential election against Michael Dukakis. Today, November 10th, it was announced that Waxahachie, Texas would be the site for the world's largest particle accelerator. The news had leaked to the press early, and many of the physicists driving to Fermilab on that Chicago morning had heard the bad news via their car radios. They waited and gathered throughout the halls of Fermilab and pondered the future. Would the lab be shut down? What about their jobs? Later that day, around noon, they found themselves sitting in the main auditorium, where the lab's director, Leon Lederman, was going to address the disappointing news. Just a month earlier, Lederman had won a Nobel Prize for work he did in the 60s. Expecting a somber speech, the audience erupted into a fit of laughter when Lederman donned a comically large cowboy hat. After the noise died down, Lederman began to read his speech. Much like George Bush 2 nights earlier, he had 2 speeches prepared, one for the best case scenario and one for the worst. Lederman began by expressing his disappointment in the site selection, and like many of those there, he maintained that Fermilab would have been a better location to build the superconducting super collider. As for Fermilab's future, he reminded the crowd that the SSC wouldn't be up and running until at least the year 2000, and that in the meantime, Fermilab's Tevatron would remain America's biggest collider. They had 10 to 15 good years left in them. Not to mention, they would likely play a key role in R&D for the SSC. But despite his assurances, the crowd was always going to be gutted. As he wrapped up his speech, he put the cowboy hat back on and left the crowd with a final message in his best Texas accent. Call me Tex.
Ranger offers over 1 million high-quality products, from motors and belts to switches and sensors, helping maintenance engineers keep production lines moving. Call, click, or stop by. Ranger, for the ones who get it done.
Despite the doom and gloom up in the Windy City, there was still a firm belief that the project could succeed down in the Lone Star State. Remember, Texas winning the site competition wasn't a fluke, and it wasn't a matter of corruption. There was a strong, legitimate case for why Texas was one of the only locations that could pull off this giga project. The site in Waxahachie was just a short drive from the Dallas-Fort Worth metropolitan area, by one metric the fourth largest in the country, and it was home to the second busiest international airport in the country. But most importantly, Texas was big and Texas was rich. At this time, in both population and gross state product, Texas was third and was likely to overtake New York within the next decade, leaving only California in a league of its own. And for a multi-billion-dollar project like the SSC, you needed a wealthy state willing to hand over some cash. And that's exactly what Texas lawmakers did. During the site competition, state lawmakers promised over $1 billion in funding. But at the same time, you could make a lot of the same case for Chicago, Illinois, also one of America's largest cities. Texas had one big advantage though. The Fermilab site in Chicago had lost out because of a local and vocal protest movement. Texans, on the other hand, were excited for the super collider. They wanted it built here. There were a few residents of Ennis County who were less than pleased. They had to be displaced and had their houses bought out, but a surprising amount of the locals were on board. Mayor Jordan of Waxahachie said this is the biggest thing, literally and figuratively, that's ever happened to us. 5 local counties even agreed to raise vehicle license taxes to help pay for the new road construction. And at the state level, support was just as strong. Texas was the only state that had held a statewide competition before selecting Waxahachie as their submission, a process that generated significant enthusiasm for the project. In fact, statewide support for the SSC was so strong that in a public referendum, voters agreed to provide an additional $1 billion or so in state funding. Very few states could match that amount of dough. But Texas was willing to go a step further and front-load their investment during the first 2 years of construction if it meant it could get the ball rolling faster. Texas as a whole is sometimes unfairly viewed as a redneck, unintellectual backwater, when in reality, Texas's cities are major hotspots for semiconductor tech, aerospace, and, of course, defense contracting. In recent memory, the state had acquired a major new Navy base and a mammoth semiconductor research lab called Sematech in order to keep up with Japan's rising dominance in chip manufacturing. You'll also find NASA's mission control at the Lyndon B. Johnson Space Center. It puts the Houston in Houston, we have a problem. All of this is to say that Texas had clout when it came to projects of this scale, and a large part of that is due to Texas's presence in Washington. Take it from Joe Barton, congressman for the Ennis district where the SSC was going to be built. We've got 27 congressmen, 2 senators, and a president. If any state can do it, Texas can do it. You could make a strong case that Texas was the single most influential state in all of Congress, and it wasn't just a sheer numbers game, although that certainly helped. True power in Congress doesn't just come from votes. One yay in a sea of nays isn't going to matter much. At least in this time period, Texas was one of the few states that could be counted on for bipartisan cooperation. In fact, it was the only state that held bi-weekly luncheons attended by members of both parties. Additionally, Texas Democrat Jim Wright was Speaker of the House. The Speaker has the power to make committee assignments and controls what bills get sent to what committees. Other Texans of note were Martin Frost on the House Budget Committee, Jim Chapman, who chaired the House Appropriations Committee, and Ralph Hall, who chaired the House's Science, Space, and Technology Committee. In the House, Texas had a stacked deck, and they weren't so bad in the Senate either. Republican Phil Graham served on the Senate Budget Committee, and for the Democrats, you had Lloyd Benson.
I served with Jack Kennedy. I knew Jack Kennedy. Jack Kennedy was a friend of mine. Senator, you're no Jack Kennedy.
He had recently lost the election where he ran as VP, but he was still the chair of the powerful Senate Finance Committee. Any budgetary bills need to make it through there before they can be voted on. So, if you wanted to, say, I don't know, indefinitely prevent a bill from being voted on, he could do that. Not only that, if any testimonies were held, the committee chair gets to lead and dictate the questioning of witnesses. True Washington influence comes from committees. And finally, you had George Herbert Walker Bush in the White House.
But then we come to priorities. The Super Collider is big priority, a big part of our investment in America's future. And when you talk basic research, this is the Louvre, the pyramids, and Niagara Falls all rolled into one. And where once we reached for the moon above to explore new frontiers of our universe, Soon we'll begin to tunnel below to learn about the fundamental question of science, how our universe began.
His support for the project had less to do with him being a Texan, and more so that the SSC began under Reagan when he was VP, and it would be bad optics to change his mind now. And if you had Bush on your side, you also had his presidential veto. Sure, Congress could vote to kill the SSC, but as long as they didn't have a 2/3 majority, Bush could veto any budgetary bill as a last line of defense. Of course, Texas is just one state, and even with all their influence, they can only do so much. They needed other states on their side. Texas had won the lottery: 4,500 permanent lab jobs, 2,200 construction jobs, and $660 million in yearly lab funding. Once the site contest was over, many of the other states lost interest entirely, and with no incentives, they'd sooner vote to axe the project than vote to keep it. But just because the grand prize was claimed doesn't mean there weren't consolation prizes. Texas was going to have to rely on the great American pastime of corporate lobbying. In comes the Texas Cartel. Not a literal cartel, that was just the nickname given to the Texas National Research Laboratory Commission. It was a lobbying and management group made up of a selection of powerful local business leaders, and it had been formed by Governor Clements to help the state win the site selection contest. Among these Texas businessmen was billionaire H. Ross Perot. For some of you, that name might ring a bell. We'll be getting back to him much, much later. The cartel was quickly joined by other lobbying groups. You had ISAC, Americans for the Super Collider, and the National Superconducting Collider Coalition. All funded by Texas, yes, but operated as if they were national organizations. Why? Because their job was to convince the other 49 states who weren't getting to host a massive public works project. The main mission of the lobbying groups was to contact companies in as many states as possible and generate interest in contracts for the construction. It's estimated that nearly 8,000 contracts were committed, totaling somewhere around $200 million. By one estimation, 47 of the 50 states had been awarded at least one contract. This was a tried-and-true political tactic commonly employed by the military-industrial complex, perhaps better known as pork barrel politics. Make sure every state has a piece of the pie, no matter how small, and it makes it hard for politicians to justify defense spending cuts. You can't slash the defense budget. If you do, steel plants in Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Pennsylvania, all of them will have to shut down. Do you really want your vote to be responsible for thousands of layoffs? Of course, by sheer coincidence, many of the most lucrative contracts were awarded to states who had senators and congressmen who just so happened to have seats on appropriations committees, budget committees, science committees, etc. Hey, aren't you a senator from Louisiana? Say, would you and your constituents be interested in a magnet plant? See, we need a lot of magnets, and you want jobs for your people to make some magnets. I feel like this would be a mutually beneficial arrangement. After months of the cartel greasing just the right wheels in Congress, the House and Senate agreed to allocate nearly $500 million towards construction. This budget wasn't without any speed bumps, though. A group of 3 congressmen had proposed an amendment asking to delete construction funds and allocate less than half of that for more R&D to give more time to find international partners for the project. The House voted 330 to 93 to begin construction on the SSC. This margin of victory was huge. Excellent news for the SSC. The SSC had officially gone from R&D blueprint to an active project. After the crushing disappointment at Fermilab, there was a clear path forward. It didn't take long for things to go off the rails. Director of the SSC lab, Roy Schwitters, was faced with his first major dilemma. Who was going to replace Maury Tigner as project manager? Maury's technical knowledge of the project had been unrivaled, and the loyalty of his staff was fierce. Losing him also meant losing many of his loyal employees, resulting in a knowledge gap during the transition from California to Texas. But that wasn't the only thing not to make the transition. One of the key elements missing from the project management was a cost and control system. These days, it's practically a given that any major project in both the private and public sectors will employ a robust tracking software to keep tabs on timelines and budgets. But in the late 80s, with computer use still becoming mainstream, physicists weren't widely using them yet. On the contrary, many physicists actively resisted using such a system, as they viewed it as another layer of bureaucracy and micromanagement that was keeping them from their actual work. In hindsight, not implementing a tracking software was a disaster waiting to happen. Not to mention the contract signed with the Department of Energy legally required one to be implemented. They just didn't do it. Back in the R&D days under Maury Tigner, there had been a successful system being used, and with no one to bring it over, it evaporated into thin air. Roy Schwitters needed a strong second in command, someone who could handle the day-to-day stuff while Schwitters focused on working with Washington. While searching for a permanent replacement, Doug Pewitt stepped into the role and made attempts to implement this system, but faced firm pushback from physicists who hated the system because they viewed it as micromanagement. Even senior managers like Helen Edwards kept making excuses to avoid using it. But this was a multi-billion-dollar project and would very much come back to bite them later. Eventually, Schwitters found his ideal candidate and set his sight on Richard Briggs, who had led an accelerator program at Lawrence Livermore Labs. Now, Briggs was a competent guy, but bureaucrats in the DOE, specifically Robert Hunter, saw things differently. Hunter thought that Briggs lacked the ability to manage such a large-scale project and blocked his appointment to the deputy director position. This kneecapped his authority, making it hard for Briggs to get anything done. But to a certain extent, Hunter had valid concerns. The price tag for the SSC sat at around $15 billion, nearly 25 times more expensive than Fermilab's Tevatron. Hunter was insistent that the management team needed someone who had experience managing billion-dollar projects, possibly someone from a military-industrial firm. For all these reasons, Hunter made it his mission to wrestle away control from the physicists and make sure that the DOE and the government as a whole had final say on many aspects of the project. The physicists eventually got fed up with this and elevated their concerns all the way up the food chain to the Secretary of Energy, where they argued that their signed contract granted them the autonomy to manage the project themselves. Lucky for them, the new secretary agreed, and Robert Hunter was pressured to resign in order to relieve some of the tension. This meant that Richard Briggs could finally be confirmed as deputy director/project manager. But Robert Hunter would later be vindicated. As the months wore on, it became clear that Briggs was less suited to being project manager than some had hoped, and Schwitters decided to let him focus solely on being deputy director and bring back Doug Pewitt to be acting project manager. If you're keeping track here, this is Doug Pewitt's second time being acting project manager. And again, Doug Pewitt would try for a second time to implement a cost management system, but reluctance from the physicists prevented it from catching on a second time. To make matters worse, the two private companies that had been brought on because of their experience with military contracts were turning out to be disasters. Unmitigated disasters. In a memo from one of the SSC board members, EG&G and Sverdrup were flooding the place with people, most of them incompetent or poorly suited to the tasks they were being assigned. Sverdrup was supposed to be handling construction, but according to some of the physicists, they'd been sending their third-rate employees to Texas, who would otherwise have been laid off. In fact, Sverdrup seems to have outright lied about their company's qualifications. They had been brought on to build tunnels for the project because they had worked on the Baltimore Harbor Tunnel. Except it seemed like they had zero experience digging tunnels. I don't know how that happens. The company as a whole was so incompetent that their executive, Robert Bobbins, who had been named Director of Conventional Construction, was forced to resign within months. His replacement, Leo Smith, was also forced to step down soon after. The SSC management opted to outright terminate the contract of Sverdrup, leaving a handful of physicists to have to step in and manage the construction themselves until they could find a new company to take over. The other company, EG&G, was in charge of general administration and technical support. They weren't nearly as incompetent as Sverdrup, but due to scheduling delays, their employees had very little to do except twiddle their thumbs and collect a paycheck. It's said that EG&G also tried to implement a cost and control system, but this attempt also failed. Worst of all, though, the long delays led to yet another departure from the management team. Bruce Chrisman had been assigned to handle administration, but he had opted to return home to Fermilab, leaving many unfinished tasks in limbo. For those keeping score at home, it is May 1989, and all but 2 of the original managers have either resigned or been forced off the project. That left Roy Schwitters as director and Helen Edwards as head of accelerators. Now fortunately, Helen was an ideal pick for her role. She had been one of the lead designers of Fermilab's Tevatron, but she had the unenviable task of adapting the design plan first drafted by Maury Tigner before he left the project. Tigner's plan had been purposefully generic, as the Texas site hadn't yet been chosen, and it was Edwards' job to adapt it to Texas. But during this process, she had come to the realization that a lot of changes were going to have to be made. Tigner had chosen a risky design. He wanted magnets with an aperture size of 4 centimeters. This is risky because magnets have a sweet spot of sorts, kind of like a tennis racket. The bigger the racket, the bigger the sweet spot for hitting the ball. The magnetic field is the most uniform in the direct center and quickly deforms near the edges. A larger magnet aperture of 5 centimeters would fix this, so it would have a larger sweet spot, but it would be more expensive to manufacture because it's bigger. And also the diameter of the total collider would have to be extended by a few kilometers. She simply viewed the 4 centimeter magnets as too risky. If Tigner was still with the project, maybe he could have pulled it off. It was his design after all. But this was Edwards' job now, and she wasn't confident that she and her team could pull it off, so she wanted to go with a safer, more conservative, but also more expensive option. Ultimately, Roy Schwitters listened to Helen Edwards, and he was on board with the magnet change. So now it was up to him to convince the bigwigs in the Department of Energy that they needed $4 billion more. Just sweep it, just a little bit. But since Reagan left office, Bush had appointed an entirely new team of bureaucrats to head up the department. And the new Secretary of Energy had some strong opinions on how the SSC was going to be managed from here on out. On November 9th of 1989, 2 very important things happened. Number 1, the Berlin Wall came down. Number 2, Roy Schwitters visited Washington to deliver some very bad news to the new Secretary of Energy. A man who wasn't exactly in the mood for bad news because of the first thing. A couple years earlier, both the US and USSR had agreed to scale back their nuclear arsenals. But the fall of the Berlin Wall marked a clear turning point in the Cold War. It was basically over. And now the American public had to reckon with the consequences of the insane nuclear buildup of the past decade. Turns out when you test thousands of nuclear warheads, you generate tons of nuclear waste. The 80s had given rise to a vocal anti-nuclear weapons movement, and thanks to the Chernobyl disaster, it had gradually morphed into an anti-nuclear anything movement as well. Remember, part of the reason Fermilab lost out on the Super Collider was the vocal anti-nuclear movement. Now, of course, the Super Collider has nothing to do with nuclear waste, but because it was the same department, its budget and public perception were also going to suffer. There was immense pressure for the DOE to clean up the mess they had made, a process that would end up costing billions of dollars. A 1996 estimate pegged the total cleanup cost at $646 billion. To put it in perspective, a single year's worth of nuclear weapons cleanup was going to cost more than the entire estimated cost of the collider. To tackle this crisis, President Bush needed to appoint a new Secretary of Energy to spearhead the cleanup effort. Hence, Admiral James D. Watkins. Yeah, remember him? Chair of the AIDS Commission? And you thought I was just soapboxing. Well, yeah, I was, but it's all connected. It seems like whenever Reagan and Bush had a tough problem they didn't really care too much about, they called in Admiral Watkins. Thankfully, compared to his last White House job, Watkins was slightly more qualified for this one. Trained as a mechanical engineer, Watkins had served most of his career in the Navy and even commanded a nuclear submarine. For this reason, he had an immense respect for the technical wizardry of nuclear physicists and was generally in favor of the SSC and its mission. Not to mention it was a priority of President Bush. Watkins was a military man at heart, and he planned to bring discipline and order to a project that he saw spinning wildly out of control thanks to the mismanagement of long-haired academics. He was deeply afraid that if costs kept ballooning as they were, Congress was guaranteed to axe the project. During his 4 years as Secretary of Energy, Watkins would be one of the SSC's fiercest allies and defenders. But at the same time, his militaristic management style would only exacerbate tensions between the physicists and the DOE, and he would make several key moves that would directly undermine the power of the physicists in charge of the SSC. Anyway, back to that fateful November day. Roy Schwitters had finally agreed to the magnet changes requested by Helen Edwards. Schwitters then informed Henson Moore, the second-in-command of Watkins, that the SSC would likely require a budget increase. Apparently, Moore's response was, either we're going to build it for the figure we agreed on, or we're not going to build it at all. When Admiral Watkins learned of the required cost increases, he apparently, to use an expression I'm just now hearing for the first time, he became non-linear. God, I love that. And reportedly had to be scraped off the ceiling. Schwitters stated that the next time he met with Watkins, he was screamed and sweared at. The SSC management and the DOE had enjoyed a brief truce where things had been going smoothly, but tensions had once again rocketed up. Emergency meetings were called to discuss the possibility of downscaling the size and energy of the collider in order to keep costs down. One of the executives, Wolfgang Panofsky, argued that there was nothing sacred about the target energy of 40 TeV, and that lowering it to 34 TeV would still likely be enough to find the Higgs boson, among other things. 30 TeV or lower? Yeah, that could be a problem, but 34 was doable. However, Panofsky was outvoted because the cost savings would only amount to about $1.5 billion, which would be unlikely to sway any deficit hawks in Congress, and changing the design to be weaker would be terrible for optics. Over in Europe, the plans for their next generation collider were beginning to take shape, with a projected total energy of 14 TeV. Keeping the SSC's energy at 40 TeV was not just for scientific reasons. It was a political move to keep Congress from asking, hey, why don't we just join up with the Europeans? The SSC had to be leagues ahead of anything Europe was doing to justify its existence. Whether Congress would agree to the extra $4.5 billion would remain to be seen. Watkins remembered the 330-93 vote of the 1989 budget cycle. The SSC hadn't been in danger then, but that was still 93 enemies in Congress, and Watkins wanted that number to go down. So in the meantime, he got to work making changes. This project's scope rivaled that of the Manhattan Project and the Panama Canal, both of which were projects led by generals. By God, he was going to save this project money, and he didn't care whose toes he stepped on in the process. In his eyes, the only people who could get this project under control were some of his friends from the military-industrial complex. Watkins viewed the magnet development as one of the key issues plaguing the project. It was always behind schedule and hemorrhaging money. This pressure led to Schwitters appointing Tom Bush to lead up the magnet development. Tom Bush had a PhD in engineering physics from a US Navy school and had spent much of his career managing multi-billion-dollar submarine and missile programs. Given the sheer number of magnets they needed for the project, Bush was an understandable pick and was undeniably effective at his job. But Tom Bush also had a militaristic management style that rubbed many physicists the wrong way. He forbid anyone outside his division from attending meetings and cracked down on the sharing of information with outsiders. Physicists value the free flow of information, and Bush essentially said, no, you tell me how you want your magnets made, and I'll make them for you, end of story. There are also stories of times when he, intentionally or accidentally, referred to his magnets as missiles. Beyond parody. This toxic work environment directly led to the resignation of acting project manager Doug Pewitt, leading to another multi-month span where they had to bring in another acting project manager. Roy Schwitters needed a permanent project manager, stat, and so he settled on Paul Reardon, who not only had extensive management experience, but he had also helped to build the Tevatron at Fermilab. Most physicists agreed he'd be a great choice. The Admiral had other ideas though. He suggested an old pal of his, Edward Siskin, an engineer who had served in the nuclear navy. Soon, a compromise emerged. The physicists would get their pick with Reardon serving as project manager, but the Admiral would also get his way, with his boy Siskin slotting into the newly created role of general manager. On paper, this meant a reporting structure of Reardon under Siskin and Siskin under Schwitters. On the one hand, Siskin's appointment would bring in much-needed management to the project. On the other hand, many physicists suspected that this was a covert attempt to add in additional layers of bureaucracy to wrestle away control from Schwitters by bypassing him entirely. Watkins may have respected physicists for their technical knowledge, but that didn't mean he trusted them with $1 billion project. In early 1990, Congress passed a bill that granted Watkins further control of the project, and created the Office of the SSC, a management group entirely within the DOE. Watkins then dipped into his Navy contacts yet again and recruited Joseph Cipriano to be project manager of this new office. Watkins told him that he calculated a 50% chance that the project would be killed if costs didn't come down. Cipriano's mission was to clamp down on those costs, and Watkins basically gave him equal power to Director Schwitters. In particular, Cipriano completely took over the contracts for tunneling and construction, which enraged Schwitters and his management team. So with just a few rapid appointments of his friends, Admiral Watkins had erected a parallel management structure, all of whom could report directly to him. He had found a way to entirely bypass the physicists, and there was almost nothing they could do to stop him. Besides these three critical appointments, there was an emerging culture clash between the physicists and engineers from the military-industrial complex. As a rule of thumb, physicists like having the choice to swap out components or materials at the very last minute to maximize performance. But engineers are used to following strict timelines, locking in parts very early on to guarantee low cost and low risk. And thanks to the Admiral's appointees, they made sure that when it came down to it, the engineers would get the final say. Jamming a bunch of physicists and engineers onto the same project without a pre-existing working relationship was always going to lead to some friction. But I don't think anyone expected it to be this much friction. At the risk of beating a dead horse here, if the project had instead gone to Fermilab, there would already have been an established staff of physicists and engineers who worked well together, and you wouldn't have the same friction. But again, if ifs and buts were candy and nuts, we'd all have a Merry Christmas. As the military contractors gradually took hold of more and more of the project, many experienced physicists felt they were being micromanaged. Think back to the three main pillars of the project. They're the tunnel, the magnets, and the detector. The tunnels and magnets were now firmly in the grasp of the military-industrial complex, and the physicists were clinging to the detector as the last bit of agency they had on the project. This meant two things. Many senior physicists were fed up and were opting to leave the SSC, but this also meant that many of the new hires coming to Texas were young and inexperienced physicists with nothing to lose, which only further contributed to the project's disorganization. Again, there was a push by Watkins' bureaucratic appointees to get a cost control system running, but it was violently resisted by the physicists. Helen Edwards in particular was known to write cost estimates on notes on her wall, which she'd update by hand without telling anyone else. Eventually, tensions between the physicists and DOE bureaucrats exploded again, resulting in another dramatic resignation. Somewhere along the line, when the DOE had approved the increase in the magnet size, there had been a disastrous oversight. The magnets alternated between two types, dipoles and quadrupoles. The design documents had been updated so that the dipoles had been increased in size from 4 to 5 centimeters, but the quadrupoles had remained at 4 centimeters. They had spent months prototyping the wrong dimensions. It was, without a doubt, the worst design mistake made during the entire project. The only way that would work would be to feed a custom manufactured beam pipe that varied in thickness, something that would be prohibitively expensive. Helen Edwards estimated that updating the quadrupole dimensions would cost nearly $100 million, but her suggestions were completely shut down by Siskin and Cipriano. Schwitters couldn't overrule them, and that was the final straw. Edwards packed up her gear and returned home to Fermilab. It is April 1991. It's barely been 2 years, and every single original manager, except for Schwitters, has either resigned or been forced off the project. It was hard to argue that Admiral Watkins wasn't effective. He had slowly reined in a project that was quickly spiraling, but the collateral damage of a toxic work culture might have doomed the project in unforeseen ways. Now, it's important to keep in mind that while all of this was going on, the SSC has not been lurking out of the public eye. It did not enjoy the relative lack of oversight that previous accelerators had. All while it was undergoing management upheaval, resignations, and internal squabbling, the SSC had been enduring a three-pronged attack. Vicious criticism that questioned whether the project should continue to exist. Prong 1, the media. In the early days of the SSC, the media had reported on it favorably as a way for Americans to show the Europeans who was boss. In one article, the New York Times stated that American accelerators should be designed to win or not be built at all. The 3-0 loss in the boson race cries out for earnest revenge. But by the 90s, the American media was singing a very different tune. The average journalist lacked the scientific knowledge to write about the goals and capabilities of the project, and therefore wrote about the parts they did understand, the ballooning cost and growing mismanagement. So it should come as no surprise that the average American perceived the project as an ever-expanding money pit, and not the next step forward when it came to understanding the universe. Even science-focused media wasn't especially kind to the project. The influential American journal Science ran a couple dozen articles on the SSC in a 5-year period between 1983 and 1988. Of those couple dozen, only 5 focused on the technical aspects. All the others covered the rapidly growing cost of the project. The SSC had cultivated a perception not as a science project, but as a public works project, and one that mainly benefited Texas at that. And although your first instinct might be to decry the so-called lazy journalists, can you really blame them? Particle physics is supremely abstract, full of weird names and terms, and is generally just very confusing. Look, I'm the one narrating this, and I don't fully understand it. It's not my thing. I think you could make the case that this was partially a failing of the particle physics community. For many decades, particle physics had enjoyed the unwavering support of the US government and had not been subject to much public scrutiny. But now, with their giga-machine being paid for by taxpayers, it was their job, their responsibility, to convince the public that the cost was worth it. There was a pervasive attitude among particle physicists that they shouldn't have to pander to Joe Schmo. They should just be allowed to get on with their work. A real, you reap what you sow kind of situation. There were exceptions to this, of course. Steve Weinberg wrote a great book on the SSC, for instance.
I don't think it's true that elementary particle physicists have claimed that their branch of science is more important than other branches of science. And I'm reaching an age at which I'm beginning to think that research on the prostate is more important than anything else.
But the MVP was still Leon Lederman. He was an immensely talented educator who gave dozens of speeches and wrote books trying to explain just what was so important about the goddamn Higgs boson. It was him who popularized the term the God particle. But this effort to educate the public was too little too late. And 18 billion, or however high it was going to go, was too steep a price. Contrast this with NASA. NASA's budget reached an all-time peak during the space race, accounting for 4% of the annual US budget in 1966. The Apollo program spent nearly $257 billion in just over a decade. And even as budgets dwindled during the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, humans were still being sent into space, albeit with some help from foreign partners. NASA has always had 2 key things in its favor: the enthusiasm of the public and a concrete mission statement. NASA spends millions of its budget on outreach programs to engage directly with the public education system, teaching kids from a young age about planets, asteroids, satellites, and the like. Ask any 8-year-old to name the planets, and they probably can't. Ask the average adult to name a single lepton, you probably can't. So when NASA says we're going to land on the moon, or we're sending a rover to Mars, every American knows exactly what that means and why that's cool as hell. And even though a moon landing doesn't have much in the way of real-world applications, we recognize that along the way, we've learned how to launch satellites, telescopes, and more. Particle physics doesn't have that. The fact of the matter is, you can televise a moon landing. You can't televise the Higgs boson. And that leads us to prong 2, other scientists. Simply put, there was an ongoing civil war between big science and small science. Big science meant billion-dollar giga-projects like the SSC, the space station, sequencing the human genome. Big ideas that were meant to showcase American competitiveness, but with no clear short-term payoffs. Small science, on the other hand, was everything else. The niche, unexciting research that is, nonetheless, the backbone of innovation and progress. Unfortunately, small science was often critically underfunded or not funded at all. And thus, an army of academic critics rallied their forces and got to work attacking the SSC.
Mr. President, how about experts in the private sector? What is their view of the SSC program? And here is how they ranked them. Number 1 was the Human Genome Project. Number 2 was the National Aerospace Plane. Number 3 was the space station. Number 4 was the Strategic Defense Initiative. And number 5, the superconducting supercollider. In other words, Mr. President, America's corporate scientists rated the SSC dead last in terms of its benefits to our national competitiveness.
And these critics weren't no-names either. Many of these people represented the condensed matter community. Nobel Prize winner Philip Anderson led the charge on this. The 1980s were a major period of change for superconductivity, and it seemed like every month a new material was found that supported superconductivity at warmer and warmer temperatures. The argument was that high-temp superconducting magnets would be much stronger and could operate without the need for helium coolers, which in the long run could reduce the ring diameter by a factor of 5, potentially saving billions of dollars. They were basically demanding that the SSC project be put on hold for a few years to study the new materials. 2 separate academic panels investigated the topic, but ultimately found that it could delay things by anywhere from 4 to 8 years. A delay this long could ultimately kill the project, and thus it was decided to move forward with the current magnets. In retrospect, I should note that to this day, no such breakthrough in room temperature superconductors has occurred. And just a few years later, Philip Anderson had gone from wanting to delay the project to calling for its outright cancellation. He was joined by a few other big names. Big science has gone berserk. The American Physical Society, an influential organization within the field, was forced to edit its project and the of 5, potentially saving billions of dollars. They were basically demanding that the SSC project be put on hold for a few years to study the new materials. 2 separate academic panels investigated the topic, but ultimately found that it could delay things by anywhere from 4 to 8 years. A delay this long could ultimately kill the project, and thus it was decided to move forward with the current magnets. In retrospect, I should note that to this day, no such breakthrough in room temperature superconductors has occurred. And just a few years later, Philip Anderson had gone from wanting to delay the project to calling for its outright cancellation. He was joined by a few other big names. Big science has gone berserk. The American Physical Society, an influential organization within the field, was forced to edit its official position on the SSC, otherwise the condensed matter community was threatening to leave. And thus the APS made the delicate change from we endorse the SSC to we endorse the SSC if it gets finished on time without hurting the funding of other subjects. As part of its marketing campaign, SSC proponents had made a big deal about the many potential spin-off technologies that could arise from any discoveries. They touted concepts such as better MRI tech or high-speed maglev trains. This was widely seen as a slimy tactic, as particle physics was at best tangentially related to these offshoots.
Doctors who today announced that protons from the giant atom smasher will be used in medical treatment.
Time of the gentleman has expired.
My friends, this site will use the protons from the super collider to cure cancer. This is the future of America. This is the project we ought to support. Vote down this amendment.
Gentlemen's time has expired several times.
Everyone agreed that the SSC would be excellent for physics, but its critics didn't think it should come at the expense of every other field. And can you blame them? The SSC was getting more money each year than dozens of other labs combined. A lot of these attacks were being done in public through newspaper editorials and interviews. But the most dangerous part was that they were also testifying in front of Congress, and Congress was listening. Gradually, these big science detractors were gaining allies within both the Republican and Democratic parties. Remember how I made a big deal about just how influential Texas was? Well, Texas had made a few enemies. Texas faced criticism from other smaller states, generally from the Northeast and Midwest, for what they perceived as favoritism towards a wealthy and privileged state. During the military buildup under Reagan, many states in the so-called Sun Belt benefited, as they were a hotspot for defense contracting companies. The Rust Belt, on the other hand, stagnated as their economies depended heavily on manufacturing jobs that were being undercut by countries such as Japan. So what better punching bag than Texas? After all, Texas was already home to several major national projects, and it wasn't uncommon to hear these bloated projects referred to as Texas pork. And this coalition of smaller states was led by a rival that was nearly just as influential as Texas, Illinois. Just a reminder, Illinois was home to Fermilab, which had just narrowly lost out on the bid to build the SSC. Following the announcement of Texas winning, tensions had flared up, but a truce had emerged. The SSC wasn't going to be operational for much of the 90s, which meant that in the meantime, Fermilab still had America's best accelerator, and it needed to stay competitive during this time. The conditions of the truce were simple. If Texas's members of Congress voted to support Fermilab projects, Illinois' members of Congress would vote to keep funding the SSC. And this truce had managed to hold for 2 years. But as Congress entered the budget cycle for 1991, they hit a speed bump. Fermilab needed an upgrade if it wanted to stay relevant, so work had begun on a project to boost the energy of the Tevatron's main injector, an upgrade that would cost $81 million, a comparatively humble number next to the $1 billion requested for the SSC that year. In the House, one of the SSC's allies, Congressman Bevel, called a closed-door meeting of his Appropriations Committee. Whatever emerged from that committee would be the likely budget for the year. The SSC team waited with bated breath. A day later, the news came. It was not good. The SSC had its budget slashed, $200 million less than requested by President Bush. But while Texas at least had some hope to cling on to, Illinois was gut-punched. All funding for the main injector upgrade had been zeroed out of the budget. None. In retaliation, an Illinois congressman proposed taking the $80 million from the SSC and directing it to the main injector, but that amendment was defeated. Too late though, the damage was done. Texas and Illinois were at each other's throats. The uneasy truce had crumbled. Illinois was looking out for their own interests now. Do you remember that old 330 to 93 vote? Well, that had been the first real battle in Congress over the SSC. It wasn't much of a contest back then. The SSC was heavily favored to win that vote. But that resistance had been orchestrated by a ragtag bipartisan alliance full of some of the fiercest deficit hawks in the entirety of Congress. And they had slowly been gathering allies. 3 of the major players were Rust Belt Democrats: Michigan's Howard Wolpe, Ohio's Dennis Eckhart, and Wisconsin's Dan Obey, all high-ranking members of their respective state delegations who had seen their hometowns suffer economically for the past decade. The most recent addition to the team was Kansas Democrat Jim Slattery.
Mr. Speaker, when we talk about this question today on the Super Collider, those of us who are opposing the Super Collider aren't doing so because we're against scientific research. And let me point out that the chairman of the Science, Space, and Technology Committee in 1992 also said, and I quote, "To fund this project would require massive reductions in other critical science programs, including other high-energy physics programs." Keep that in mind, my friends.
But none of them were comparable to the absolute terror that was New York Republican Sherwood L. Boehlert. Say what you will about his politics, but I've watched more than enough C-SPAN to tell you that he is a phenomenal public speaker and a brutally efficient interrogator. And if you happen to be sitting across from him during a committee questioning, you better pray for your life.
We are hearing, as we have just heard, some claims made for this project. Contrary to all the hype, the SSC will not cure cancer, will not provide a solution to the problem of male pattern baldness, and will not guarantee a World Series victory for the Chicago Cubs. Let's have that understanding right here and right now. Secondly, a very important observation. You will notice that the proponents of the SSC are from Texas, 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 and Louisiana, and maybe someone from California. But you'll notice that the opponents are from Kansas, the heartland of America, from Ohio in the Midwest industrial belt, from New York, from all across the country.
Boehlert has been in the background for some time now. He first entered the story during the site selection contest. When the international New York and Quebec site was rejected, it began to worry him that project management wasn't concerned about controlling their budget. Admiral Watkins had promised Congress that 30% of the funding for the SSC would be non-federal, almost $3 billion. And prior to him, Secretary Harrington had made a similar promise just a few years earlier. But given the lack of international partners and repeated cost overruns, Boehlert didn't exactly trust the lofty promises of a few bureaucrats, and so he called their bluff. He introduced a bill stating that 25% of the SSC's funding would have to come from foreign sources, and it passed the House without much trouble. Only issue is, it never got through the Senate. The SSC had a powerful ally in one senator in particular, Bennett Johnson of Louisiana. Johnson was powerful even by the standards of the Senate. He was the chair of not one, but 2 committees, Energy and National Resources, and the Appropriations Subcommittee on Energy and Water Development. Johnson simply refused to let the bill pass through his committees. In his eyes, he thought the US should fund the project on its own, foreign partners be damned. I'm sure it also helped that General Dynamics had been chosen to build a magnet plant in his home state, and thus the bill never came to a Senate vote, therefore never making it a law. But in the eyes of the House, this didn't really matter. So they voted on it and passed, making it the will of the House. So if the SSC management went and ignored it, the SSC would be punished. Soon after the kerfuffle between Texas and Illinois over Fermilab's upgrade, Boehlert and Slattery introduced an amendment to cut all funding for the SSC and leave the $80 million or so for the main injector upgrade. Boehlert argued that the SSC was supposed to be funded entirely by new money, not siphon away funding from the rest of science. The amendment to kill the SSC came to a vote, and the totals were 251 to 165. That's good. We're good. The SSC is still safe. Slattery's amendment was always going to be a long shot, but the margins were shrinking at an uncomfortable rate. 2 years earlier, in 1989, the equivalent vote had passed, 330 to 93. Somewhere in those 2 years, the SSC had lost 80 supporters. And if you look at a map of where the votes came from, it's easy to see. Green shows states where they were in favor of the SSC, gray is neutral, and red is against. The Sun Belt and the Rust Belt were at war, and their generals were Texas and Illinois. Now that was just the House, and the budget still had to make it through the Senate. The SSC's budget slid into the Senate at a meager $885 million. Luckily, they still had their powerful ally, an additional...
There's DNA. Then there's heavy-duty DNA.
$251 to $165. That's good. We're good. The SSC is still safe. Slattery's amendment was always going to be a long shot, but the margins were shrinking at an uncomfortable rate. 2 years earlier, in 1989, the equivalent vote had passed, 330 to 93. Somewhere in those 2 years, the SSC had lost 80 supporters. And if you look at a map of where the votes came from, it's easy to see. Green shows states where they were in favor of the SSC, gray is neutral, and red is against. The Sun Belt and the Rust Belt were at war, and their generals were Texas and Illinois. Now that was just the House, and the budget still had to make it through the Senate. The SSC's budget slid into the Senate at a meager $885 million. Luckily, they still had their powerful ally in Senator Bennett Johnson, and thanks to him, the bill emerged from committee with an additional $150 million locked back on. The SSC budget survived the Senate vote, 62 to 37. But still, it was hard not to worry about future votes. As a side note, whenever the House and Senate disagree on an exact budget number, a hybrid committee consisting of both House and Senate members ends up getting formed, and they hash out the final number. In this case, the disagreement was small, and thus a compromise figure just shy of $1 billion was reached. This would be the last time such an easy compromise would be made. From this point on, the House and the Senate would only become further at odds. Anyway, the Soviet Union collapsed. Not all at once, mind you. A few economic reforms over here, a wall getting torn down over there, a saucy little attempted military coup, you know, one of those. And wham bam, thank you ma'am, now you've got yourself 15 new independent nations, an economically drowning Russia, and a big hole where there used to be a big bad villain, TM. In the blink of an eye, the US government had lost its major justification for why it was spending so much money on its military, and by extension, overly ambitious Cold War era science projects like the SSC. With the Soviets gone, who were we trying to beat? Not to mention, America was deep into another recession. Due to deregulation that began under Carter and continued under Reagan, a real estate bubble backed up by fraud led to over 1,000 savings and loans companies folding. Funnily enough, Texas was home to nearly half of these. At the time, it was the largest economic crash since the Great Depression. This was only worsened by losing trade wars with Europe and Japan, which undercut American manufacturing. Finally, the country was still stuck with the tedious cleanup of nuclear waste generated from a decade of Reagan and Bush's defense policies, a process that was soaking up a large portion of the DOE budget. For the first time since the end of the Vietnam War, Bush was finally scaling back the defense budget to a sizable degree. And the hope of many was that the decreases in the military budget could be used to fund other programs. These were the so-called peace dividends. Ideally, this funding would be diverted from war to address literally any other problem. healthcare, education, jobs. So what do you think happened? Text the number on screen with your answer. As part of its deficit reduction policies, Congress erected a firewall between military and civil spending. A decrease in one couldn't be used to fund an increase in the other. Congress had crushed the hopes for a peace dividend. Funny how it always works out like that. Now, for Bush, as former head of the CIA and his Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney, these military budget cuts were like pulling teeth. And for all the aforementioned reasons, his polling numbers weren't doing too great either. If only there was something he could do to kill two birds with one stone. With the Soviet Union actively disintegrating, the US needed new supervillains to focus its ire, and thus began a pair of extremely short, hot movies that were used as a showcase for all the fancy high-tech death toys that had been originally intended for the Soviets. What started off as Desert Shield inevitably morphed into Desert Storm. Basically, Saddam invades Kuwait over what is supposedly oil field disputes, and Bush assembled a UN coalition to kick him out with a side of relentlessly bombing Iraq's infrastructure and sanctions that drove the country to a state of starvation. And don't mistake this for the Simpy for Saddam power hour. It's just a little questionable that George here had such a change of heart after spending the last decade lending Saddam money, illegally selling him rockets, aircraft, and chemical weapons supplies, defending his human rights abuses, and silently cheering him on when he was invading Iran. Following Desert Storm, Bush's polling numbers shot up to a peak of 89%, a level that made Democrats wonder if it was even worth running a candidate in '92. And it helped to cement US influence in a region of the world that was previously off limits due to the long shadow cast by the USSR. And most importantly, Bush had found a new way to justify his increased military budget and its corresponding R&D funds. Would he be able to create a similar justification for the $18 billion total cost of the SSC? Probably not. And that meant only one thing was likely to save it. Someone else would have to split the bill. Foreign funding was a serious chicken and the egg dilemma. Congress had wanted firm foreign commitments before handing over major project funds, but other countries were waiting in the wings for Congress to commit to the SSC before they risked any money on the project. After months of waffling, Congress finally gave in and began funding the project mainly because of promises from multiple secretaries of energy. But several years had gone by and still not a single foreign contribution had materialized. This wasn't playing well with people like Congressman Boehlert. Remember his will of the House pseudo-law? Go against the will of the House and you'll be punished. So what exactly was the problem? Why were other countries so reluctant to join up with the project? Let's dive down into some specifics. Europe. This one's easy. The majority of European countries were either a part of CERN or planning on joining. CERN had its successful LEP collider up and running, and talks were underway for the oft-mentioned upgrade that would allow it to collide even larger particles. Large hadrons, if you will. The SSC simply had too much of an overlap when compared to CERN's projects, simple as that. So if not Europe, who else was left? Canada was considered, given that they are right next door and the US's closest trading partner. However, talks didn't lead anywhere. Canada's physics budget is barely a fraction of the US's, and most of it was already going to their Triumph facility in Vancouver. It also didn't help that Canada was still a little insulted by the outright rejection of a proposed New York-Quebec site years earlier. It wasn't even especially far-fetched. CERN is built between France and Switzerland, but still, the idea was shut down by the Reagan admin, and it left a bad taste in Canada's mouth. Besides America's usual allies, pretty much every country you could think of got asked to join the SSC. South Korea seemed promising, and India had locked in around $100 million with the DOE. A good start, but only a drop in the bucket. To give you a sense of how desperate things were, the DOE was considering contributions from Russia and China. Yes, that Russia and that China. In Russia's case, the economy was, how can I say this, a garbage fire. So cash funds weren't feasible. Instead, it was suggested that Russia's dirt sheet manufacturing could be used to produce components at massive discounts, and those discounts could be viewed as their cash contributions. The same labs once used to develop ballistic missiles would now be used to build detector components. A Russian physicist at the SSC joked by saying, "Why, this is nothing new. For many years we made high-precision components for delivery to the United States." Unsurprisingly, this proposal was not popular in Congress. So you're telling me that instead of creating American jobs during a recession, you want to send those jobs to Russia. The SSC was having an identity crisis. It was somehow an America first, American-led, America-made project, while simultaneously also trying to become an international center for scientific cooperation. Odds were, if the Nobel Prize came out of the lab, it'd be awarded to 3 Americans. a prospect that wasn't too appealing for non-Americans. There was even a really funny incident where the Bush admin was considering renaming the SSC to the Ronald Reagan National Accelerator Lab, aka the Gippertron. This was immensely unpopular with those working there because it would only further politicize a lab that was in desperate need of international partners. Thankfully, the Bush admin seemed to lose interest in this idea, much to the relief of the academics. In effect, America was saying, hey, we're building a gigantic metal monstrosity in Texas, and we want other countries to pay for it. It was a diplomatic strategy that did not find very much success. Thankfully, America learned its lesson and has never tried anything remotely similar ever again. But I've intentionally left out one country who seemed to be the most realistic hope for getting a true international partner for the SSC. A country with active support for physics, a strong economy, and with no existing commitments to another collider. The SSC's hopes depended on Japan. So why Japan? Well, outside of Europe and Russia, Japan was the only other nation with a major accelerator lab. Heck, even better, the current Prime Minister was Toshiki Kaifu, who had previously been the nation's Minister of Science. If anyone in the Japanese government would be sympathetic to a giant accelerator project, it'd be him. Diplomatic feelers had been put out to gauge Japan's interest in the project, and they were mostly positive. Japan was excited with the idea, but they wanted a clarification on what exactly partnership meant. Japan distinctly remembered the rhetoric used during the Reagan years. To cement things, a personal one-on-one request from Bush to Kaifu would lock things in. Expectations were that Bush would ask at their upcoming summit in Houston in July 1990, but no presidential request was ever made. Oh well, there's still plenty of time. Like at their next summit. Nope. Huh. Okay, their next one. Still nope. Next one? Oh my god. Are you for real? Finally though, for reals this time, Bush and Kaifu publicly announced the SSC would be a topic at their next summit in November 1991. Bush even sent a letter to formalize things. Finally, after months of dancing around the issue, some actual progress was going to happen. So anyway, Prime Minister Kaifu was forced to resign by a coalition of three powerful factions within the Liberal Democrats.
30 seconds. Planning for your family's future? Put it in the right hands with LegalZoom. It's too important to let it fall into the wrong hands. LegalZoom is the simple, affordable online solution for estate planning. If you need a will or trust, LegalZoom guides you through every step to ensure your loved ones and assets are protected. So if you need a legal hand, visit LegalZoom. LegalZoom provides access to independent attorneys and self-service tools. LegalZoom is not a law firm and does not provide legal advice.
Kaifu had belonged to the weakest faction of his party and only rose to prominence because he was a Mr. Clean candidate, untarnished by recent scandals plaguing the actual top players. He was replaced by Prime Minister Miyazawa, a politician who was much less sympathetic to scientific interests. His past political appointments included Minister of Finance, Director of Economic Planning, and International Trade and Industry. In other words, someone who was going to play hardball when it came to money. But regardless of whoever Japan's top dog was, the US was not in a position to be making any demands. For one, the US had already asked for help in the Gulf War. Japan had dragged its feet regarding the war and was criticized. Not wanting to get involved in actual combat, Japan offered purely monetary aid in the form of a few $1 billion. But the true issues were decades in the making. Classic case of reaping what you sow. The US had pumped billions of dollars into Japan post-World War II to make it a dominant East Asian capitalist utopia in a region of the world surrounded by communist states. But now, 30 years later, Japan was an economic and manufacturing powerhouse, completely kneecapping major American industries such as steel and automobile parts. And while America may have invented the silicon transistor, Japan was making it their own. In 1975, America had 100% of the semiconductor market under their control. By 1986, that share was down to 5%. Most of that share had been lost to Japan, hence why the government was so eager to fund Semitech, that other Texas giga-project I mentioned earlier. In the eyes of some American politicians, Japan wasn't just a country, it was Japan Inc., a coordinated juggernaut of a government and the private sector. With the previous November 1991 summit pushed back to January, Bush had a choice to make. Fight a trade war over automobile imports in the middle of a recession, or politely ask for a couple $1 billion for a deeply mismanaged particle accelerator. Can you guess which one he chose? Well, he didn't really get to make a choice. Bush chucked it up. Like during dinner, he fainted and then vomited directly on the lap of the Japanese Prime Minister. The incident quickly became a running joke on late-night TV. In Japan, the slang term was coined, literally translating to do the Bush thing. The approximate cause of the incident was a combination of two factors: improper medication amounts as well as exhaustion from a long journey. The incident preemptively ended the dinner and cut short any chance for a one-on-one conversation about the SSC. Now, obviously, George Bush vomiting didn't literally ruin negotiations, although it's extremely funny to think that it did. In reality, diplomats from both countries kept trying to make things happen behind the scenes, but Japan refused to budge unless Bush explicitly asked the Prime Minister face to face. Bush had 5 chances to do so, and he never did. Asking about the SSC would have put him at a disadvantage during trade negotiations, and Bush wasn't willing to take that risk. So for that reason, and because Bush faced an increasingly dire chance of re-election, the Japanese never made a commitment to the SSC. The United States would continue to take a leap into the unknown alone. As 1992 progressed, things seemed to settle down for the SSC. In fact, some things were actually going right. The work culture at the Texas site was finally seeing some successes. John Rees had just been appointed project manager, the 6th and final person to fill that role, ending a 5-year-long revolving door that had plagued the position ever since Maury Tigner first left it vacant. The previous project manager, Paul Reardon, had spent months butting heads with Edward Siskin in what some people described as having swords drawn. Thankfully, Rees and Siskin were able to get along, ending what can only be described as a complete boondoggle. And Siskin had finally managed to institute a cost-tracking software. Can we get a hell yeah in the chat? And there were even a few victories on the technical front. One building was finished, with another set to be built, and the contract had finally been awarded for the tunneling. The hope was that it would commence in fall of 1992. And if this last one doesn't make you sigh with relief, I don't know what will. They'd gotten the magnets to work. Mass production would soon follow. Clear roads ahead. It was this renewed sense of hope that carried them into the budget cycle of 1992. June 17th. Ohio Democrat Dennis Eckhart introduces an amendment to the House's energy and water bill for fiscal 1993. It was yet another amendment to kill the SSC. Here's $67 million, shut everything down, go home, you're done. Remember that just last year, this same Congress had voted on a similar amendment, and it had failed, with 251 voting to keep the SSC and 165 to kill it, a margin of 86 votes. Odds were the vote count will be similar, but with a slimmer margin. And so, the votes rolled in. $232, $181. Okay. Not the worst. Again, the margin was slowly disappearing, but it was still a win for the SSC. That's what I would say, except the totals were swapped. Hopefully, you feel just as dumbfounded as the SSC supporters did. They'd walked into this vote taking for granted that they'd have another year to get the project back on track. But in just 1 year, 70 members of Congress had changed their vote. The margin had gone from positive 86 to negative 51. Again, looking at the state level, a trend was clear. Illinois and the Rust Belt was against the SSC and gaining supporters by the day. Texas and the Sun Belt were slowly losing allies.
And we spent 3 days in hearings, and I guarantee you not he or any of the scientists excited us one iota about this project. I asked him, what do you hope it'll do? He couldn't tell me. But what might it do? He couldn't tell me. And finally, he summed it up by saying, well, if we don't do it, the Europeans will do it. And I guess I would have to say, let them do it. I mean, we can't do everything. We can't do space station and everything else. Let them do it. We'll steal their technology like they steal our technology.
Support for the project was a mile wide, but an inch deep. If it came down to it, a member of Congress wasn't going to tie themselves to an abstract money vacuum like the SSC. The reason why the votes had shifted so suddenly was everyone's favorite topic, the US deficit. In a move spearheaded by Leon Panetta of California, The House had instituted brutal procedures to resolve the nearly $1 trillion deficit. Rather than kicking the can down the road, the House had to do the dirty work. Cut programs on a case-by-case basis until the numbers got small enough. And in Panetta's words, the SSC was the poster child of Texas pork. One rival scientist called it a tremendous welfare program for the state of Texas. There's also a question of poor optics on the part of Texas. Two key Texas Republicans, Joe Barton, Congressman for Waxahachie, and Senator Phil Gramm, were well known for campaigning on cutting taxes, but in the same breath would advocate for the SSC, ruining their credibility. The irony was not lost on enemies of the SSC. Okay, shithead, you want to balance the budget? We're going to start with your project. I didn't write that, by the way. That's a quote from a congressional staffer. There are some pretty key differences between the House and Senate that explain why the Senate was inherently more likely to support the SSC. The House has around 400 seats, distributed roughly proportional to state populations. The Senate is not proportional and has exactly 2 senators per state for a total of 100. But also, House members face re-election every 2 years and represent small congressional districts. Senators face re-election every 6, and they represent entire states. House members have to worry about the immediate concerns of their local constituents, and thus might be inclined to cut projects that don't help their districts. Whereas senators have the benefit of being able to take less popular votes that considered long-term. And it was the general attitude in the Senate that the SSC, despite its price tag, was a solid, long-term investment in American productivity. That being said, it wouldn't be an easy fight. The SSC still had Bennett Johnson on their side, but for the first time, the SSC had a vocal critic in the Senate, a little old Arkansas Democrat, good old Dale Bumpers, who was ready to throw down the gloves.
Now here, there is one physicist in the country that will tell you that he knows that the Higgs boson exists and that after we spend probably $20 billion erecting this monstrosity, that we're going to find it.
Half the gross national product of today's America is made up of discoveries of the last 30 years. Half of it. And we can make this, we can say, as Senator Bumper says, these secrets of science will be there 50 years from now or 100 years from now. Well, frankly, they won't. They would have been discovered by somebody else. And the technology developed by somebody else, we don't do it.
Johnson managed to finesse the SSC's budget through committee, resurrecting it from 0 up to just over $1 billion. When Bumpers threatened an amendment to kill the SSC, several appeals were made to President Bush to make a show of support. Because Bush was facing a difficult election race, securing the state of Texas was even more crucial, and thus he met with 5 Republican senators to convince them to change their votes. And so, after hours of testimony and debate on the Senate floor, the votes came in. 62 to save, 32 to cancel. They saved it. Not just saved it, the margin in the Senate had actually grown by 5 votes. Except they weren't quite out of the woods yet. Whenever the House and Senate disagree on a budget, they have to meet in compromise. Thankfully, this committee was comprised of SSC allies, and members agreed on a slightly decreased amount of about $1 billion. The bill was once again on the House floor for a vote, but this one was much more likely to survive. See, the committee, chaired by good old Congressman Bevel, had bundled the SSC's funding with the rest of the energy and water projects for the entire country. So, if you wanted to kill the SSC, you'd also be killing funding for energy and water projects in your own districts with an election just months away. It was, in effect, the congressional equivalent of taking hostages. And it worked. The bill passed 245 to 143. The Senate had strong-armed a negative 51 vote margin into a positive 102 vote margin. They had come from the brink of death. Although miraculous and certainly better than the alternative, the SSC was battered and bruised. Foreign partners would take one look at the constant political upheaval and keep their money. Speaking of political upheaval, for the first time in 12 years, there's going to be a Democrat in the Oval Office. Unlike the 1988 election, which Bush won handily, after 4 years of a bad economy, the American public was looking for a change, with generic Democrat beating Bush in nearly every poll. Eventually, generic Democrat became Arkansas's Bill Clinton, and his campaign ran on one key phrase: "It's the economy, stupid." But it wasn't just that. Compared to Clinton and even Reagan before him, Bush was a charisma black hole. He came off as an elitist, out-of-touch Washington insider who loved to summer in his vacation home in Maine. During one of the debates, he was asked a question about how the recession was personally affecting his family, during which he glanced at his watch. But the biggest contributor to his loss were a pair of unexpected challenges from his political right. After a close primary race where he narrowly beat out Pat Buchanan, he then had to contend with someone who wasn't a member of either major party. An old acquaintance from earlier, Texas billionaire and certified short king H. Ross Perot, who you'll remember was a major fan and lobbyist for the SSC due to its job creation potential. Perot threw his hat into the ring because he was furious at the impending loss of jobs that would occur if the North American Free Trade Agreement, aka NAFTA, came into effect. The final vote totals were 43% for Clinton, 37% for Bush, and 19% for Perot. The best ever election result for a third-party candidate in U.S. history. If you run the exit polling numbers, Clinton would very likely still have won the election even without Perot taking votes from Bush. But it's fair to say that Bush had a much tougher campaign. Ironically though, by helping to unseat George Bush, Perot had put the SSC, a job creation machine, in a tough spot. The SSC had not been one of Bush's priorities, but he also couldn't terminate the SSC because it would retroactively make Reagan and himself look bad. So he made it clear he'd use his presidential veto if it came down to that. And Clinton, although not an enemy of the SSC, had made no such promise to use his veto power. Bill Clinton wasn't the only new face in Washington. Joining him was a record number of freshman House reps and senators. In fact, it was the largest number of freshman members of Congress since the post-Watergate midterm elections. And regardless of whether they were Republican or Democrat, they shared one key thing in common. They were deficit hawks. They ran on promises to slash the bloated federal deficit in any way they could. And lucky for them, there was one pretty obvious project that was almost screaming to be cut. And there was no more presidential veto standing in their way.
Left, sees Pulisic, looks right, sees Jimenez. Gives a nod to Ronaldinho in the corner with a FIFA World Cup meal. Ronaldinho sees Son in the booth. Son finds Beckham going for extra Big Mac sauce. He's got Davies at the table just behind him. Davies going for his collectible cup. Oh, a steal by Henry, who pulls his own collectible cup. Collect one of 9 legendary cups with a FIFA World Cup meal.
At participating McDonald's for a limited time while supplies last. All rights reserved. 2026 McDonald's at FIFA World Cup 2026.
There's a famous story about British scientist William Thomson. You may know him better as Lord Kelvin, the father of thermodynamics. On April 27, 1900, just a few months into a new century, he gave a speech at the British Association for the Advancement of Science. And one quote in particular has been repeated many times since. There is nothing new to be discovered in physics now. All that remains is more and more precise measurement. It's a massively ironic statement, because that same year, Max Planck would solve the black body radiation problem that led directly to the founding of quantum mechanics. And 5 years later, Albert Einstein would publish his first paper on relativity. But would it surprise you to hear that Kelvin never said anything like this? Kelvin never predicted the end of physics, and in fact, if you listen to his speech, he specifically identifies 2 remaining clouds that were left hovering over the tree of physics. And as it happens, those 2 clouds would turn out to be quantum mechanics and relativity. Fields that, to this day, have only led to further and further branches on the tree of physics with no end in sight. Kelvin wasn't perfect. He saw no future in hot air balloons and airplanes, but it's this urban legend that has unfairly stuck to his reputation the longest. Some historians believe that the origin of this urban legend comes from 6 years earlier, when an American scientist, Albert Michelson, claimed in a speech that the great principles had already been discovered, and that physics would henceforth be limited to finding truths in the 6th decimal place. Now, in fairness to Michelson here, he'd always been more of an experimentalist than a theorist, and some historians argue that he was more so making the case for further investments in scientific equipment. Because if you don't have precise enough equipment, you don't really know what it is you don't know. What we can gather from this anecdote is that it's a recurring sentiment in human history where we feel close to the end, close to figuring out the final mysteries of the universe, only to tug at a thread that unravels a dozen new questions. In 1911, Ernest Rutherford was firing alpha particles at gold atoms and discovered something amazing. Atoms are almost entirely empty space, with the exception being an extremely small but extremely heavy nucleus. Many years later, reflecting on these results, Rutherford said, "It was quite the most incredible event that has ever happened to me in my life. It was almost as incredible as if you fired a 15-inch shell on a piece of tissue paper and it came back and hit you." Particle accelerators had not been invented yet, and they wouldn't be for another 18 years. But Rutherford had just reinforced the great human tradition of smashing things together and seeing what happens. There have been dozens of days that humans have announced the end of physics. Maybe one day, one of them will be right. After a decade of planning and 2 presidential elections, digging for the SSC's tunnels was finally going to begin. But almost immediately, 2 disasters struck. One physical in nature, and one PR. Just days after Clinton's inauguration, a portion of a tunnel collapsed during construction, killing a worker. Tunneling on that section was immediately halted pending investigation, while a section with stable geology continued to be worked on. 2 months later, Roy Schwitters, director of the SSC, had spent much of his busy week being interviewed by reporter Malcolm Brown. In a lapse of judgment, brought on by overwork and frustration, Schwitters loudly complained about congressional interference in the project, something he wouldn't have done if he remembered that a New York Times reporter was nearby. "We should be devoting ourselves to completing the machine as rapidly and cheaply as possible, and get on with real science. Instead, our time and energy are being sapped by bureaucrats and politicians." The SSC is becoming a victim of the revenge of the C students. When the quote hit the papers, it was instantly damaging, and Roy Schwitters quickly became the cliché of the arrogant and pretentious physicist who felt entitled to billions of taxpayer dollars. It was an omen that business as usual would not play well in this new political era. The election of Bill Clinton was not necessarily a bad sign for the SSC, but it also wasn't a good one either. On the campaign trail, Clinton had expressed his support for the project, but it was the kind of half-hearted, conditional support you give to projects that aren't really the focus of your political platform.
Then there are some programs that I think are quite central to our economy that require us to continue to fund them. Many are controversial with those who don't benefit from them, but I believe in some of them. I'll tell you a couple I believe in. I think that we should continue to fund the superconducting super collider because I think it's good science, even though it's expensive.
That is the voice of a man who could not care less about this project. He's talking about it like a dad who has to pay for piano lessons for his kid who clearly does not like piano lessons. Clinton's unofficial campaign slogan, "It's the economy, stupid," had won him the election, and his priorities were set accordingly. Although it started under Bush, the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, would be continued under Clinton and would take up much of Clinton's time during his first year in office. When it came to science, Bill was more than happy to delegate to his right-hand man, Vice President Al Gore, who had served on the Science and Tech Committee in the Senate. And if you know anything about Al Gore, it shouldn't be surprising that the Clinton admin shifted research priorities towards renewable energy, climate change, and environmental research. Other winners under this new admin were bio and medical research, and basically anything with a short-term economic payoff. This unfortunately came at the expense of basic physics research, which included the SSC. Al Gore was instead pushing for a variety of smaller projects under the DOE budget: an advanced neutron source in Oak Ridge, the tokamak plasma experiment at Princeton, and a bee factory to be constructed at Cornell or SLAC. And finally, he was pushing to keep Fermilab's main injector upgrade alive, which you may remember from last time was a major sticking point for the state of Illinois in Congress. The SSC had spent years draining funding from other smaller projects, and now the reverse was happening. Also worth noting, with no obvious military threats on the horizon, the military budget would be on the decline for the foreseeable future. Although it never got back down to Jimmy Carter levels. Clinton even made changes to the proportions of federal R&D as well. Instead of the absurd 40-60 split of civil versus military under the Bush admin, Clinton went so far as to reduce the split to an even 50-50. Very on brand for Democrats. He promised to keep everything mostly the same, but with exactly 10% less war. As for the DOE top dog, Admiral Watkins was no longer the Secretary of Energy. Despite his disagreements with the project management, he had been a fierce ally of the project, and losing his support in Congress would be a huge hurdle to overcome. But his influence didn't disappear completely. His pals from the military-industrial complex, Cipriano and Siskin, were still firmly embedded in the management chain at the SSC, for better or for worse. Watkins' replacement was Hazel O'Leary, a lawyer from the Carter admin who specialized in energy policy. Her appointment reflected the new priorities of Clinton and Al Gore. The SSC in high energy physics was not a presidential priority. Rather, her appointment was intended to help address climate change and nuclear weapons cleanup. That's not to say she wasn't going to at least try to help the SSC. There was still the matter of foreign funding, and although Bush had failed to get Japan to sign on, there was still hope. To kickstart talks, in February, O'Leary had her staff draft a letter to the Japanese PM. Except this letter was never sent, because Clinton had already sent a letter discussing the economy, and Clinton's science advisor refused to approve another one. Another attempt to send a letter was blocked a month later, but this time by the National Security Council. They worried that it would send the message that the SSC was more important than trade relations and financial aid to Russia. And so, SSC allies turned their focus on the first ever summit between Clinton and Miyazawa. An in-person presidential request could still make some magic happen. In preparation for this summit, an A-list team of physicists ended up making a visit to Washington where they spoke with Al Gore, who assured them that the SSC was a top priority for the administration. Apparently, this didn't translate into talks with Clinton, who focused almost entirely on the ongoing trade war with Japan over automobile parts. So again, the US refused to give a clear presidential endorsement, and Japan, again, responded by just not giving them money. Funny how that works. However, even in the off chance that Japan signed on to the project, it was beginning to look like any amount of money would be far too little, far too late. To get the project back on schedule, it was estimated that $2.3 billion would be required for fiscal year 1994. In the best case scenario, Congress might approve half of that. There was some in the Clinton White House urging to cut their losses and kill the project altogether. In particular, the newly promoted Leon Panetta. If you remember from earlier, he was the budget hawk who helped force the vote that nearly took out the SSC last summer. But other advisors hatched a plan that would hopefully keep the project alive. Rather than keeping to the original construction schedule, they would stretch out the project by 3 or 4 years. This would add to the cost by at least $2 billion, finally pushing it over the $20 billion mark. But the critical factor would be that the yearly costs would go down, and smaller yearly costs would have a much better chance at making it through Congress. A delayed collider was much better than no collider at all. The atmosphere at the Waxahachie lab site was one of urgency and determination. With budget season looming over the horizon, there was a push to get as much built and completed as possible. Maybe if they showed some progress, Congress would be kinder to them. And after the accidental death just a few months prior, 6 kilometers of tunneling had been completed. Late last year, the magnet test lab had just finished construction, as had the linear accelerator portion of the injection sequence. The superconducting magnets, which had been a constant financial drain on the project, were finally robust enough for a manufacturing run. Soon, they'd be pumped out in the thousands. And finally, the DOE had approved construction for one of 2 major detectors. This detector alone was projected to cost around $1 billion, and yet the DOE had only allocated $1 billion for both detectors. I think it's fair to say that those in Waxahachie were living in a different world. One detached from the financial concerns of the rest of the country. One where the SSC's success hinged on just how much they wanted it. They'd already sunk so many years and so much money into it. What else could they do but work their asses off? The SSC's fate was never in their hands, but I'm sure it felt like it was. June 23rd. The House is once again voting on whether to cancel America's most expensive scientific giga-project. After the nail-biter that was 1992's budget vote, hopes were not high. This Congress was full of eager freshman members with budget bloodlust. Both Democrats and Republicans were elected on campaign promises to reduce the deficit, slash big government spending to help put more money in the pocket of the American taxpayer. And so, the votes are coming in.
When you see an oversized load,
Slow your pace. Give them space. Oversized loads are different from other vehicles. They are bigger, heavier, and take longer to stop. Sometimes, pilot cars are present to warn drivers about oversized loads and help guide them. Don't try to get around an oversized load or a pilot car. Let them guide you. Slow your pace. Give them space. Learn more at esc.org.
It's still alive. A vote margin of 1 is as slim as it gets. Although not uncommon in the Senate, it's absurdly unlikely in the House. Just the stuff of divine intervention. Well, maybe not divine, but certainly an intervention from a higher power. It turns out both Al Gore and Bill Clinton had spent the previous night making desperate one-on-one phone calls with individual representatives, doing all they could to sway their votes. And against all odds, they succeeded by one single vote. It couldn't have been written any more perfectly. And that's why I hate to do this. I need to pull the rug out. Now, you knew it couldn't be true. You knew this was coming. I couldn't resist one last fake out. This wasn't the vote count for the SSC. It was the vote count for the ISS, the International Space Station, aka the other multi-billion-dollar giga project that was hemorrhaging money. It lived to see another day by the skin of its teeth. Remember the old space station freedom idea back in the Reagan days? Well, that idea was a money pit that underwent 7 redesigns before ultimately being scrapped. The ISS concept revived the project, but there is a critical difference now. With the Cold War officially over, NASA and the Russian Space Agency had agreed to pool their funds, in addition to contributions from Canada, Europe, and Japan. But even then, it was not a sure thing. The ISS received harsh criticism from scientists. The ISS wasn't space science, it was space hardware, a $200 billion piece of hardware unlikely to teach humanity anything new beyond some basic anti-gravity research.
Dr. Bluebergen up at Harvard said microgravity research is of micro importance. You can do microgravity research right here on Earth and save yourselves $100 billion.
And yet, the image of astronauts from several nations living and working 420 kilometers above the Earth is too compelling not to pursue. Clinton's rationale should be obvious. If the US gave up on the ISS, it would have meant a huge political fallout from several angry nations who were committed to funding it, as well as nearly 75,000 American jobs disappearing. Clinton was not having an easy first year in office. Although he had won the election, he had been accused of marital infidelity on the campaign trail. In late 1993, Don't Ask, Don't Tell would succeed in pissing off both the left and right sides of the aisle. His healthcare reform bill, spearheaded by First Lady Hillary Clinton, was deeply unpopular with Republicans, and even his own party was split on it. Democrats to his right and left criticized the plan as misguided. Furthermore, his economic stimulus bill was being filibustered by Senate Republicans. Clinton already lacked the influence to push through his main campaign promises. It's not a surprise then that if he had to choose between support for one science gigaproject, he'd choose the one that was splitting the cost between several nations. So on June 24th, the very next day, when the SSC came up to a vote, the result was exactly what you'd expect. The total was 280 to 150, a 130-seat margin to kill the SSC. The House was going to be heard, and you do not ignore the will of the House. And just like last time, it would come down to the Senate. Clinton had predicted this path. I always anticipated that if we were going to save the Super Collider, we would fight for it in conference. But this would be a much tougher fight than in 1992. Members of the House remembered what happened last time, how they were strong-armed by the Senate, how they had used their energy and water budget to take hostages. The House wasn't going to get played a second time, so Representative John Dingell, a prominent SSC critic and member of the Northeast Midwest Alliance, played one of the few cards they had left. He demanded a televised hearing in front of his Oversight and Investigations Subcommittee. He was going to turn the DOE inside out and get to the bottom of the mismanagement and general buffoonery that plagued the SSC. Dingell was a skilled interrogator, notorious for going after scientists for any misuse of taxpayer funding. This intense 9-hour hearing would prove to be a PR nightmare for the SSC. Dingell stated that the SSC ranks among the worst projects we have seen in terms of contract mismanagement and failed government oversight. SSC management was reamed out for the delays in getting a cost management software up and running, and it would emerge that the total magnet cost might reach $5.2 billion, double what had been estimated. Energy Secretary O'Leary was hit particularly hard during questioning. She blamed the management structure put in place under Admiral Watkins, with Cipriano basically removing all control from Schwitters. But she also lambasted the physicists too, arguing they couldn't be trusted to run things on their own, and she vowed to wrestle away any construction responsibilities away from them. Following the hearing, a full audit of the project finances was performed, with generous estimates saying the final cost would be $20 billion, and the worst-case ones saying $24 billion. This was before any cost increases from the proposed stretch out. Gosh, do you remember the days when $8 billion seemed like a lot? With the SSC's future in jeopardy, Texas panicked and held back nearly $80 million in funding, leading to Director Schwitters having to cut costs left and right. It led to over 300 layoffs. It didn't help that Schwitters and Cipriano had become even more dysfunctional. They were no longer on speaking terms. This came after a Washington Post article where they published a private memo where Cipriano recommended that Schwitters be fired. Senator Bennett Johnson, in an effort to paint the project in a better light, held a less adversarial hearing in the Senate. Dale Bumpers yet again introduced his amendment to kill the SSC.
Now, the senator wants to challenge the $20 billion figure, I guess. That's right. Okay. We've been through this so many times, I know what you're thinking before you say it. And I'll just simply say, we're not to $20 billion yet, but we're not to $13 billion yet either. But we know we're headed there. You gotta be eating and smoking something awful strong to believe that this is the last word.
I mean, are we going to just let this country sink slowly like the sun in the west at evening tide and say we can't compete anymore? We have no more scientific curiosity. We have no scientific competitiveness. We're going to let this budget deficit fueled by entitlements just overwhelm us.
The votes came in.
Grainger makes it easy to find and order the products your team depends on around the clock. Because when boxes are packed, pallets are stacked, and trucks are waiting at the dock, the last thing you want is to run short on the supplies that keep your warehouse moving. Grainger is there to help make sure nothing runs out when shipments are rolling out. Call 1-800-GRAINGER, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
57-42 to save the SSC. The Senate had come through yet again, albeit with the worst margins so far. The SSC was losing allies left and right. Round 1 went to the House. Round 2 went to the Senate. The ultimate fate of the SSC will be decided in round 3. The House and Senate were going to meet in a conference committee yet again. Would a compromise be made and the SSC live on, or would the House get its way? Boehlert and Slattery, the perpetual enemies of the SSC in the House, anticipated a repeat of the dirty tactic used in the 1992 budget vote. The House and Senate Compromise Committee was likely to be filled only by members of the Appropriations Committees, almost all of whom were SSC allies. The two of them rallied to get SSC opponents included, and the Speaker of the House ignored them, citing precedent. So how exactly do you compromise between a Senate who wants $1.2 billion and a House who wants, $0? Well, at least according to the Compromise Committee, you give them the full $1.2 billion. You can imagine that this enraged much of the House. It was one thing to keep funding the SSC, but it was an outright insult to award it the full budget request. And once again, just like last time, the SSC's budget wasn't on its own. It was surrounded by an entire year's worth of water and energy funding that goes directly towards local district projects. Hostage-taking at its finest. If the House truly wanted to kill the SSC, they had to be prepared to also kill the rest of the energy budget. But actually, no. Jim Slattery refused to accept this, and so introduced a motion to explicitly order the Compromise Committee to delete SSC funding from their budget report. And so, the House members, sick and tired of being made out to be fools, voted overwhelmingly in favor of the motion. 282 to 143. The hostage analogy kind of breaks down here, so I'm going to do my best. It's kind of like everyone in town agreed that you should let the hostages go, and then you got sniped in the head. 115 Republicans and 166 Democrats made their opinions clear. The SSC had to stand on its own. When the actual final bill came to a vote, the House made its will known. 332 to 81. The SSC was dead. It ends here. Shut it down. The Senate, knowing they were defeated, agreed 89 to 11. For 114 freshman members of Congress, this was their first time voting on the SSC. 82 of them voted to kill it. If the House demands it, it will find a way. George Bush once compared the Super Collider to the pyramids of Giza. He of course meant it in the wonders of the world sense. And in a ironic twist of fate, his words still kind of hold true. The Super Collider is not a world wonder, but it is a tool. Following the fateful House vote that ultimately killed it, Senator Johnson and Congressman Bevel held a conference committee in a last-ditch effort to save the program, during which they begged and pleaded with Boehlert and Slattery. This begging and pleading led to an almost comical compromise. The SSC got to keep its $1.2 billion budget. The catch was that it could only be used to shut the project down. US Congress had just approved the most expensive funeral in world history. In a quote that is extremely insensitive, coming from a man from Louisiana, Senator Johnson would tell reporters that the SSC has been lynched and we have to bury the body. When the SSC was officially killed in Congress, only 22 kilometers of tunneling had been complete, just a little more than a quarter of the total loop. In total, $3.85 billion had been spent. The reactions from the academic community were Leon Lederman described it as a tragedy for the field and everyone in it. The government decided, in its wisdom, that high-energy physics has no future. The day after the House vote that killed the SSC, our old friend, Burton Richter, received a phone call from Senator Bennett Johnson's chief of staff. It was over. There was no coming back from this. Sitting across from Richter was John Hastings, current director of Furlong. For the past month, he'd been quietly asked by several DOE officials if he'd be willing to step in and replace Roy Schwitters in a last-ditch attempt to save the project. At this point, he couldn't save the SSC. It would be the equivalent of becoming captain after the Titanic hit the iceberg. But, at the very least, he could prevent it from taking down America's other labs along with it.
When the Congress voted to terminate the funding for the SSC project, I realized it'd be very important that this be done well, both for URA, which also runs Fermilab, of which I'm director, and for the whole high-energy physics community. The people who built this laboratory had struggled very, very hard to try to bring it to completion against really difficult odds. I mean, if you had to pick a time to build a laboratory, at the end of the Cold War was not a good time.
Some worried that Schwitters would view the move as a coup, but he didn't put up a fight. In his resignation letter, he stated that he came to the URA in Texas to build the SSC, and that is no longer possible. He felt uncomfortable and inexperienced in the role of funeral director. After 5 years, every original name on this management chart had left the project. His departure would help reduce tensions at the Waxahachie site. Following the nasty televised hearings where Secretary O'Leary had thrown Schwitters under the bus, their relationship had become extremely bitter. Removing him was a welcome move for all parties. Although you would think that shutting a project down would be much easier than starting it, there was still a tangled mess of delicate issues to resolve. The most politically sensitive issue was how to deal with Texas. Texas Governor Ann Richards was livid. She had tried to get Bill Clinton to veto the cancellation, but multiple sources have indicated that he gave her an ultimatum. It's either the SSC or the space station, two major projects that Texas had business ties to. The choice at that point was basically obvious. So instead, she demanded that the DOE reimburse them $1.2 billion for what they had already invested, in addition to $519 million for any new research that could be carried out at the Waxahachie site. But given the Congress had only given $1.2 billion total for the entire project shutdown, that reimbursement appeared to be impossible. Despite this, it was the opinion of the White House that Texas should be repaid, not only because of the potentially nasty legal and political consequences, but also because, and I quote here, it's the right thing to do. In the end, Texas had invested about $1 billion in cash and assets, and received back $393 million in cash and $956 million in land and facilities, as fair a deal as they could hope for given the circumstances. By early 1994, those who were left at the lab said it's like working in a morgue. The initial termination benefits for all the laid-off employees were apparently so harsh that some people feared for Secretary O'Leary's safety if she attended a meeting with thousands of about-to-be-fired workers. O'Leary met with John Peoples to discuss the termination benefits, and Peoples pushed hard for better terms. Later, in the eventual all-hands meeting, she dramatically ripped up the old contract in shreds. Everyone was going to be taken care of. John Peoples, she stated, is a guy who knows how to run something. In a clever move, Peoples realized that they could use some of the remaining budget to provide advanced computer training to the soon-to-be unemployed workers. This allowed many of them to quickly find jobs in Dallas, saving the DOE around $300 million in unemployment benefits. As for the remaining buildings and infrastructure, Governor Richards put together a committee to plan future research projects. The magnet lab could be used pretty much as is, and the magnets could go towards any future colliders. The linear accelerator, on the other hand, had potential use in development of radioactive cancer treatment labs. The computer infrastructure could easily be turned into an advanced computing lab. Non-physics proposals included turning the site into a prairie restoration project or using the tunnels for geology studies. In the end, however, none of these projects ever happened. Congress debated funding for all of them, but literally every single one was deemed too expensive to be worth it. Magnet lab? Too expensive. Cancer research? There's no nearby medical facilities. Geology studies? The tunnels were filled with water and sealed off. I can't put an optimistic spin on this. So much money was wasted for no reason. The only positive outcome was that 10 school districts and 1 university received the leftover tech equipment. That's it. Like many Democrats, Texas Governor Ann Richards lost her re-election bid in the Republican Revolution of 1994. But I should stress, like everything else in this story, her loss can't be chalked up to just one cause. The SSC collapsing didn't lose her the election, but it certainly didn't help. The GOP could have put literally any no-name in a suit and they probably would have won. And the man they chose wasn't exactly a no-name. To date, she is the last Democrat to ever hold the office of Texas governor. By this point, John Peoples had effectively been running 2 labs, the SSC and Fermilab, and he was at his limit. He resigned in the summer of 1994. Unexpectedly, American particle physics would stumble on to one last major discovery. Fermilab had found evidence of the top quark. The 6th and final quark was detected, with its mass matching up perfectly with theory. Fermilab, even with its 30-year-old tech, had one last breakthrough under its belt. With that, it was official. All 6 quarks had been discovered in America. When the SSC was canceled, it meant minor good news for a few smaller labs. SLAC got $69 million for its B factory, Oak Ridge could start its advanced neutron source with $33 million, and finally, Fermilab got $48 million for its main injector upgrade. The US wasn't going to lead particle physics for much longer, but at least for the next 10 years, Fermilab would remain relevant. In the years since, Waxahachie has considered a number of non-science projects to make some of their money back. A wind tunnel, an exotic mushroom farm, 6 Flags under Texas. Decades earlier, Waxahachie had been the filming location for a few westerns, and in a poetic example of history repeating itself, the SSC site was used as a film set for Jean-Claude Van Damme's Universal Soldier, and the stupid yet amazing show, Prison Break. After nearly 10 years of unuse, in 2006, a comically Texan multimillionaire named Johnny Brian Hunt finally bought the site. Hunt was well known for having a hand in a dozen different business areas, and he planned to bring his newest venture, data storage, to Waxahachie. I don't think there's ever been another human being who's ever been this excited about data storage as this man. I'm always dealing in things I know nothing about. What turns me on is when 20 of your best friends tell you it won't work. I think that does something to me. In a final cruel twist of fate, as if the site was cursed, Hunt slipped on a patch of ice and hit his head on the pavement. He died from injuries a few days later. The data center project ended with him. Later, a chemical manufacturer known as Magnablend purchased the land in 2012. Although if you believe the YouTube comments, they're just a facade, and the tunnels are actually being used as a series of bunkers for the global elite. As a tribute, Magnablend named their new facility the Specialty Services Complex. The SSC name, at least in spirit, lives on.
Passing 100 meters. Oxygen efficiency decreased.
I told you this story doesn't have a happy ending, and I guess that's true if you only focus on the American perspective. Pretty much the same day the SSC was canceled, American physicists knew that the future of multi-TeV physics lay in Europe, and thus began the slow bureaucratic process to get the US a seat at the table. CERN and their new Large Hadron Collider, or LHC, was the way forward. For most of you, I think you know how this story ends. But even then, the LHC was never guaranteed to succeed and did indeed face several catastrophic hurdles that could have led to the same fate as the SSC. The fact that it did succeed in spite of those hurdles is worth celebrating and worth learning from. The LHC concept is much older than you might expect, with plans first forming in 1984. In the usual European fashion, however, the plans were much less ambitious and involved a multi-stage upgrade process. The first stage was to build the LEP, the Large Electron Positron Collider. Perhaps you remember, CERN director Herbert Schopper testified in front of Congress in 1987, begging the Americans to join up with them to no avail. The LEP was completed in 1989 with a ring circumference of 27 kilometers. The LEP could collide low-mass leptons up to 0.2 TeV, but to break through the multi-TeV barrier, they would need to support heavier particles, and thus Stage 2 was going to use hadrons, aka any particle consisting of 2 or more quarks. So already, maybe you see a couple advantages the LHC had over the SSC. First, a unified governing body of 19 countries instead of just one.